I think we're already live, Nikhil. It says we're live.
Great. Hello, and thank you for joining us for MediaNamas discussion today on the impact of the cybersecurity directives. As we know, the government released these directions via its agency CERT-In last month, and these will lead to significant changes around how digital companies, big and small, and even sole proprietorships with their own websites operate in the interface with CERT-In. This will also impact our privacy and our usage of VPNs. We hope to understand the impact of these directions better with the help of a stellar set of speakers at our roundtable discussion, which will begin shortly. I'd like to thank Internet Society, Meta, and E2E Networks for supporting this discussion. It's also our privilege to have Dr. Joe Hall, a distinguished technologist for a strong internet at the Internet Society, who will be delivering the closing keynote today. So please do stick around for that if you want to understand what it means for the internet at large. Let's dive into the roundtable discussion now. Sarvesh?
Thanks, Nikhil. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. I think we have a lot to get through today, but before we get into the nitty-gritty details, the specific questions, I wanted to set the tone with the larger picture here, in terms of what prompted CERT to bring forth these rules, the context in which it was. And I think if Suman, if you can, you've been working in cybersecurity for a while now, and you have a fair idea on the history and context. So if you can just give us a brief explanation on why we're here, that'll be great.
Thanks, Sarvesh, and thanks, Nikhil, for having me. It's a pleasure, honestly speaking. So the context has to be super brief here, but the thing is, a parliamentary committee has been looking at these services, cloud-based services like VPNs and all, for a while now. And they have come up with a couple of reports, specifically report number 230 and a follow-up report number 233. And this happened sometime back last year. And if you go through those reports, you would pretty much see what we are seeing today in terms of guidelines. So the thought process was already there a year and a half back in terms of what the government thinks they should do in order to regulate these services and to curb cybercrime. Now, back then, a lot of us, and I think Nikhil was also very vocal about how those how the document reflects a factually misguided understanding of tech and how it might be very difficult to implement for people or organizations. Okay, so we did criticize this way back in 2021, but apparently nothing much has changed, and CERT has gone ahead and come up with these guidelines. Sarvesh, back to you. Does that work?
Yeah, Suman. And in terms of what's been happening over the last year in the cyber attacks that have been taking place, the ransomware attacks specifically, can you just give us more sense on what happened and why those would have led to this directive?
Correct. So I think ransomware has been one of those issues that have been there but not talked about, as Nikhil mentioned earlier, by mainstream media, right? And it's only very few people like you, Sarvesh, some of those extremely tech-focused journalists with whom I've spoken, who actually understand the issue. So I also think that there's, we've not had a broader conversation between, cybersecurity industry and media around ransomware, but it has been there. And we've seen ransomware attacks compromising a number of sensitive organizations in India, okay? And the way things are moving in this world, ransomware and in general cyber attacks often are used as, I would say, used in place of low intensity kinetic conflict. So they are basically a substitute that you can get for real cheap, real quick, and without having having to, sacrifice people. So increasingly, nation states are taking this up, and frankly speaking, our national security posture is not yet at a position where we can fend these attacks off successfully, right? And I think the government has been feeling that, and they've tried to come up with some sort of a response. Because if you look at the CERT guidelines and also the parliamentary committee reports that have come up in the last couple of years, you would get, this sense that these documents are essentially talking about two different things. One, they're talking about incident response, and the second thing that they're talking about is they're talking about transparency and KYC into crypto-related transactions, right? Now, the one place where we see both these things come together is a ransomware attack. And that is why I think that these guidelines are in effect a backhanded way of the government saying, okay, here's our strategy on ransomware, but we really don't want to call it ransomware because, there's a geopolitical context and stuff like that. Right?
Got it. Yeah, I think even in the directive itself and even the FAQs, they try to explain why why they've come up with it. The government tries to explain, but they don't mention directly ransomware or anything. And I think the reason that they've given is in the past, we've had cyber attacks that we could not fully investigate because there were lapses in what data we could collect. And that's why we have this new directive. But that's an interesting point that they make, because when I was speaking with Tarun Dua, who runs a cloud network, he couldn't be here with us today for an interesting reason. But he was telling me that when there's an abuse case, like when someone abuses his service and when law enforcement comes to him, so he deals with law enforcement. He's actually currently dealing with law. I'm not at liberty to talk much about what he's dealing with, but he couldn't attend because he's with law enforcement right now because someone abused his service. And then yesterday when I was talking to him, he was telling me, this has been going on for 3 days actually. So he was telling me yesterday that the directive actually does not solve the problem that law enforcement has. The kind of stuff that they're asking, the 180 days of logs, the 5 years of KYC information, all these seem like the government's intent is there, but then the intent doesn't necessarily help law enforcement in what the reason behind this entire directive was. So it's kind of like, his point was they should follow the money trail. They should follow, instead of having such broad mandates on all companies, all small entities, sole proprietorships, they should follow the money trail. And that's interesting over here because I think the finance sector already has a lot of regulations. And if Richa could explain to me more on what's already happening in the finance sector in the cybersecurity front in terms of what regulations the RBI already has and how these new directions are going to impact the finance sector, that'll be great.
Sure. Hi, you're able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Thanks, Avish, and thanks for setting up the context, and to my previous speakers. These guidelines, so to speak, they are in effect regulations that have come out. Now we have the government appointed nodal agency. They have appointed this the CERT-In as the nodal agency. So in effect, it's kind of the regulation and not just the guidelines. They came like about a month back, and still most of the industry across segments, we are figuring out, the gap that their current system has. However, I'll just straight away jump to the fintech ecosystem, how it is going to impact it. If it is going to be implemented in the way that it has come out now, it is going to have some consequences, and it will have, it will create a lot of disruption in the internet ecosystem, in the digital ecosystem, and the fintech sector that I represent. First of all, it is targeting each and every entity because it has a broad remit called service provider. So any service provider includes everything, whether it is cloud service providers or platform companies, payment companies, any fintech, government organizations, just about anyone. I want to first of all highlight whatever has been the most main point on reporting incidents within 6 hours. Now, first of all, we need to understand that this is very generic as to what does it mean by reporting within 6 hours. To report all the incidents to CERT-In, does it mean reporting the incidents or does it mean breaches? if it means breach is still understandable. We can report it. It is doable. However, if it is incidents and if it involves all kind of incidents, then that is going to be a challenge. Only the critical incidents or the severe incidents, as I understand from my backend team, they are the ones which can be reported, say within 6 hours or as soon as possible. And when I look at some of the global parameters, some of the global frameworks, and say the regulator like our joining MAS, they say that only breaches to be reported are one with the high severity or high intensity incidents. They will only be reported. So we need to have certain kind of a benchmarking of what kind of incidents to be reported if it covers all incidents, right? Second point is there are certain highly sophisticated ransomware, and I'm sure many of my tech colleagues will be able to talk about in greater detail, but I'm just scratching the surface here. Most of the highly sophisticated ransomware may not fully manifest itself in just 6 hours, and it may take longer time for any organization to understand what is going to be the impact, whether it has hit us and how they're going to respond to it. So things may not become clear in the 6 hours itself.
I'm curious about one thing, Dicha. Just from a legal perspective,
Yeah.
when does the clock start for the 6-hour time frame of reporting? Like, when you look at the IT Act and you look at notice in that, the Supreme Court wrote down notice to be a court order, but now here's the timeline attached. So this is similar to notice, when you become aware of an attack having taken place. So when does that clock start?
Actually, Nikhil, this has also been my question, because normally what we understand is as soon as it comes to the notice of an organization. But so we should report. But those were earlier the generic statement by RBI, which had no timelines, that you should report the incident as soon as you it is brought to your notice. But now, since you're talking about the 6 hours time, I'm not sure. And that is the question when I want to raise, that being brought to notice, or we discover, or when we have remediated that, what is it even? I'm not sure. And that's
so there is another aspect, right? Now, because this is tech, there are servers and there might be mechanisms set which will indicate that there is some unusual activity that has taken place. So, or even in the logs, it get noticed, and some sort of an alert goes out to, let's say, a team at, say, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Now, they don't notice the alert until say 8 o'clock in the morning, right? Or 9 o'clock in the morning. Does the clock start from when the notification from the server went out from a tech perspective, or does it start from the moment someone saw the message? And then how do you define when? Because there's so much of ambiguity around this.
Absolutely. Even I am confused. I have ambiguity as well, and I cannot answer this question, because this is something that we need to raise it. We need to raise it up with the CERT-In. And that, just before this call, I was having internal discussion on cybersecurity with my CISO and everyone. So this is the thing, that when does a 6 hours deadline start? So I'm not able to answer this question. In fact, I want to raise this in this kind of a forum.
So I'm curious, does anyone have an answer to this? Does anyone have an answer? Yeah, someone.
If I may, it is typically from the point in time when a human being has received a report.
Yeah, but I can receive a report on my email or my phone. I may not see it.
Yeah.
So there we apply judgment typically, but the idea is from the time a human being has read a report, if you would prefer that word, but that is not really spelled out even in HIPAA per se. Okay, and most of the reporting guidelines that are seen across the world, they also come with this stop the clock feature, as in you can buy extra time. It's not it's not cut and dried 6 hours or 72 hours always. So
and I will just clarify one thing here, Nikhil, as you ask this question. My team is suggesting that we need a clarification for 6 hours response time is for notifying or being brought to notice the incident. So there is a difference, as you mentioned, that whether it is the technical trigger or when it is actually brought to the notice of a human being and he acts upon it. So this is the question, very, very specific question that we also want to raise it. Is it for notifying or being brought to notice?
Yeah, because it can't be a court order, like in the IT rules.
Yeah.
So again, then, sorry, I'll send it back to Sarvesh. I'll jump in if I have any more questions.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there's one thing about reported within 6 hours, but where does the 6-hour number come from? Like, what is it? Like, is there a study done on it? Why not 6.5? Why not 7 hours? Because is there an international precedent to 6 hours?
So
anyone can.
So Vish, if I take that 6 hours, I know it looks very, very how does it, very less time. But when I was just scanning through some of the circulars of RBI, cybersecurity circulars, and there's a circular in 2016, which RBI came out with for all the banks. In that, they said that any kind of a reporting incident has to be reported within 2 to 6 hours for the banks. But that was just for the notification. So I don't know if they have taken that 6 hours from there or what it is, but we do have this kind of a precedence in one of the RBI circular in the Annexure 3. This is 2016 circular of cybersecurity.
Got it.
So how big is your team, Richa, that's actually managing this? Because see, according to the FAQs, the same rules apply to a large organization like PayU, and the same rules apply to MediaNama. The same rules would apply if I was running, if I'm an IT consultant and running a blog or even whatever, and that gets hacked. So same rules apply to everyone, right? So what kind of resources are required? And maybe someone can also jump in here for that timeline of 6 hours to be met. Richa, if you could go first, like what's the size of your team that looks at cybersecurity?
Okay, so Nikhil, it's a valid point that if I relate this with the bank, then RBI in its earlier circular said that you need to set up a SOC in place, and so similarly here they are talking about a point of a contact. So irrespective of the team size, I think deputing one person. So there is one thing called deputing one person who will act as a point of contact. But if we are talking about all the incidents to be reported, that you need to have just one dedicated person who will be reporting incidents every day, as and when that happens. And since we are talking about lots and lots of numbers, he will just be doing this job. So it's really not possible. There has to be some kind of a clarity we are still seeking. Even if we say it's a big size company, still the remit that is expected of any organization in terms of reporting all the incidents, it's not doable.
And the compliances keep going up, so the resources required to run a tech business in India keep going up. So to do anything with tech in India keeps going up.
Yes.
And
can I just complete one last time, because I have a hard stop at 3:30. When I was talking to fintech companies and also within internally at my organization, they say whenever this reporting happens, there is something called a severity methodology, which is determined by each organization: high intensity, high severity, less severity, etc. So basis that severity, the reporting happens to the regulators currently. So is it the same kind of methodology is expected when we do the reporting to CERT-In? That is number one. And number two is, as per the global framework also, the moment any organization contains a specific incident, even if it is a high severity incident, the severity is reduced because you are able to contain it. It's then the formulation of the plan in fixing that incident and doing things in a systematic manner. So the whole point is we need to have streamlining across the regulators, across the government bodies. What would be the proper methodology or the types of incidents that we can report?
And then the types of incidents here are also fairly vast.
Yeah. Yes.
In terms, because so the other thing was that should there be, like, is an incident also, let's say, an attempt at phishing, for example, as opposed to phishing actually having been succeeded? Because if you're looking at attempts are millions of attempts in a year in India, right? Everyone's the telecom operators will go crazy reporting the number of times a network is used for a phishing attempt.
Absolutely. There are so many spam notifications that each one of us receive every day.
So then we'll have to report all of those technically as per these rules legally.
As per the rules, it looks like, yes.
I think Srinidhi disagrees.
Hi, Nikhil. Hi, Richa, and everyone. So I think, so the directions add to or modify the 2013 rules. So I'm reading the 2013 rules, which originally, introduced this requirement of mandatorily reporting certain kinds of cybersecurity incidents. What needs to be reported is a cybersecurity incident, which is defined as any real or suspected adverse incident in relation to cybersecurity that violates so and so, which also resulting in unauthorized access, denial of service, unauthorized use. I wouldn't necessarily read this as every attempted event. I mean, there is some trigger sort of built in. I see Shivangi's also been wanting to come in. Please feel free if you disagree there.
I just wanted to jump in. See, there's a term called events and there's a term called incidents. An attempt to attack or an attempt to for phishing or somebody who's kind of scanning your website, they're all events. Now, all events don't necessarily result in an incident. So, an attempt to phishing is an event. It's not an incident. So I think the guidelines are very clear about reporting incidents, which is when there is something or suspected some incident happening. That doesn't mean the 100 events that preceded have to be reported. Just wanted to clarify that.
Sarvesh?
Yeah, I mean, I was also confused about that. And the FAQs, I think, try to clarify some aspects, but so some of I think the definition of cybersecurity incident that Srinidhi pointed out, I think that makes most sense when you look at it from that.
Just before Richa leaves, because she's running out of time, Richa, you have a wish list.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Nikhil.
Do you have a wish list? I know you're running out of time, so I thought I'd quickly catch you before you go. Do you have a wish list of things you want clarified or changed?
Yes, definitely. So first is on what actually needs to be reported, as I mentioned. Then if it's what are we looking at severity here, and this 180 days log that the circular talks about. So I also
can't hear you. There's a connectivity issue.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now.
Can I just post it? And
Sure.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. Is log for all the entities to be. Again, this is very generic. As per the understanding that we have, there are two kinds of log SIEM, which is the which is still we are able to comply with, but there is which essentially category of logs called application log, which is essentially the login, log out time, etc. Do you think we need to store all kind of logs? So that is again the clarification that we want. These are the two broad clarifications we need, Nikhil.
I think, Richard, we couldn't hear you in person, so we'll reach out to you for those comments.
Okay,
separately.
Sure.
Sarvesh, sorry,
Sure.
Back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Richard.
Thanks, Nikhil. Thanks, Richa. Yeah, I think Dr. Hall has made a good point in the chat. So there are some clarifications in the FAQ with regards to when an incident should be reported, but do the FAQs hold the force of law? And I think one of the points that multiple associations had made with about the directive was that make whatever clarifications that you do in the FAQ as part of the directive, as part of a revised directive. I think Kumar can talk more about that. He's from ITI, which is also part of the coalition. So can you just tell us more about, have the FAQs actually helped companies, and what do we need from the government more on that front?
Thanks, Sarvesh, and thanks, Nikhil, for getting us all together on this platform. As you rightly pointed out, it has been a long time, and we should jump back to offline or in-person kind of these situations, so that the technical challenges don't come up. And a good afternoon, evening to all of you. So as Sarvesh was pointing out, yes, I mean, we recognize that they released CERT-In along with Medi tried to resolve some of the queries which we had raised as associations on behalf of our members, and they released those FAQ documents on May 16th, which address some of the stakeholder questions with regards to the implementation. However, given the FAQ documents, and there are many people with a legal background here, and they may be able to set the context to it, the FAQs do not carry the force of law. So therefore, they do not, we think, offer enough assurance to businesses operating in India. The reason why I say that is, if you look at the FAQ documents, and towards the beginning of it, they kind of point out, and I shall take the liberty of reading it out. The document is in response to general queries received by CERT-In from time to time. It's not a legal document, and in no way whatsoever replaces, amends, or alters any part of the IT Act 2000 or any of the whatever the CERT-In response team and manner of performing functions and duties rule 2013. The FAQ, however, they mentioned the FAQ is an evolving document, and hence the version of this document may undergo changes. So, our basic, problem is that we will continue to have some of the concerns, which, let's say, what some of the other panelists here, that is Richa Mukherjee, and I think Suman, Shivangi, Srinidhi raised earlier, which is the with regards the on the 6-hour reporting timeline, the overbroad definition of reportable incidents, the requirement that companies furnish what could be termed as sensitive logs to CERT-In, the requirements that companies take action to respond to an incident as mandated by CERT-In, the requirement for the virtual service providers, the VPNs, etc., and for them to maintain and record some subscriber information, some sort of subscriber information, which comes under FAQs, the KYC, for a period of 5 years after service cancellation. So we believe that even though they came out with a FAQ document, if some of the questions that we have raised subsequently to the FAQ documents are left unaddressed, unchecked, and no, sort of changes are made to the directive, then it will have significant adverse impact on organizations, and also perhaps India's posturing vis-a-vis, let's say, the security concerns it shares with its Quad partners, with European countries, some of the other trade relationships that it is planning to enter into now, or is already into, or planning to enter into in the near future.
Kumar, this is kind of in line with what's been happening with regulation in general. There's been regulation by FAQs. If you recall, it started with the RBI's data localization, no public consultation, nothing at all. Then the RBI issues an series of FAQs in response to all the criticism it had received, and changes the rules as such accordingly. We had the IT rules last year. There were FAQs post that. There were supposed to be SOPs also that's supposed to come on, but not seen the light of day. Now you have a fresh consultation there. And now you have this no consultation publicly, at least, and you have FAQs. So it's almost like you put out a bad policy, and then you try and you dig in your heels. It becomes an ego issue, and you don't move on it. But you also issue FAQs in order to try and show that you're clarifying things. But really, they don't carry the force of law. So effectively, they don't change much. But my question is that for your companies as such, what does this non-enforceability of FAQs mean? Does it provide clarity? Does it create confusion? What sort of fear does it sort of create, if it does at all? Do they feel better after these FAQs have been issued?
Thanks, Nikhil. And thanks for raising that very important point regarding the lack of stakeholder consultation and policy implementation or imposing policies via FAQs. And you rightly pointed out about the RBI document, and contrast this with what has come out today, which is a fairly shorter consultation, if one may call it, wherein there is at least 20 days time. I'm referring to the amendments to the IT, the MeitY consultation on amendments to the IT. I'm sorry, I'm diverging a bit, but it has got a 20 days open consultation timeline, wherein they clearly mention that they will put out whosoever comments on it, it will be put out in the public domain unless somebody specifically wants them not to be. So that's something that is referred to as sort of an open consultation. And let me take the liberty of reading out what.
Well, I'm not going to cut MeitY that slack, because you can look at the IT rules last year. They ran a fairly extensive consultation and amendments to the IT rules, but two segments there, regulation of news and regulation of streaming services, there was no consultation from them on it.
So I'm not going to comment.
I'm not cutting. I know I'm not cutting.
I'm also not trying to divert from the topic, but I'm just taking an anecdotal kind of an example. But coming back to what OECD talks about a need for a stakeholder consultation, and this is something that we have been asking for consistently, is that, and I quote here what OECD says, is that stakeholder engagement is a crucial element of any regulatory policy. It helps to ensure that regulations are in public interest by involving those that are affected by regulations, which includes citizens, businesses, civil society, and other community members. Stakeholder engagement improves the quality of rulemaking by collecting ideas, expertise, and evidence from stakeholders about policy problems to be solved and the possible solutions to address them. It also ensures that regulation is user-centered and responds to the needs of those governed. By consulting all affected parties, this is very important. Stakeholders' engagement enhances the inclusiveness of policies and supports the development of a sense of ownership of regulations. This, in turn, strengthens the government, social cohesion, and compliance with regulations. Unquote. Now, that's exactly what we are looking at. I mean, people here should not be talking about what are the issues with certain regulations, but people should be, in a way, be happy about it, because come on, all of us here, including many of our member companies, they all want to have a safe, secure, trusted internet. Nobody is here for creating any harm. And what is the harm in having a stakeholder consultation before coming out with a directive which is as important or as critical as cybersecurity measures? Now, to come to the second part of your question, whether the FAQ documents help, well, people, it's an ambiguous document. As I mentioned earlier, that the FAQs do not hold or do not have the force of law. Therefore, unless somebody gets a notice, nobody knows what to do with it, or nobody knows how to react. This is more of, to my best of my understanding, this will be more of a reactionary kind of it would be more of a reaction than anything else. So right now, all we are asking is, why doesn't MeitY, instead of just coming out with FAQs and having a one-way conversation on such an important policy directive, come out and have an open forum, maybe a kind of a town hall, and try and explain as many questions as possible from the stakeholders to whom it matters. So that's the position.
So what I'm not able to get is, so MeitY and FAQs, both of them say that we consulted industry stakeholders. We've developed this over time with industry stakeholders. So what are they talking about here? Which stakeholders? I mean, is it some limited number of companies?
I would not hazard this guess.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many people who are listening in. I'm sure there are 122 participants. So I'm sure if somebody was consulted, they could raise their hands.
Let me put forth a hypothetical situation. And this is all fake, so you don't need to believe it. And I'm doing this just for fun. CERT-In, let's say, hypothetically prepares these guidelines, puts it and calls one industry body over to discuss it with them. The industry body goes and meets CERT-In, and hypothetically, along with 3 entities that are significant in the cloud space, and this is all an assumption, they're given the copies of these guidelines, and given this happened on Friday, this meeting, and they're told that they have to respond by Monday. So they send in the responses by Monday. Nothing happens. On Thursday, these guidelines are issued as is, with no inputs incorporated. But industry consultation may have taken place in this manner. I don't know. I'm maybe making this up. Does this sound like a feasible story, Kumar?
And that's what they mentioned in their FAQ documents. I will quote it. I mean, this is what they mentioned. They mention it in their FAQ document that how did you arrive? I think, let me just go to that question. I have the FAQ documents open in front of me. So they said that what was the process followed to arrive at the cybersecurity directions of 28 April? The answer to it is CERT-In in operations since 2004, based on analysis of cybersecurity incidents, trends. Certain gaps in processes of organizations and service providers have been observed by CERT-In. Accordingly, consultations with the industry and government organizations have been held from time to time, which is highly ambiguous. And based upon the inputs received from the stakeholders, draft directions were framed. Subsequently, that is the last line, subsequently, CERT-In under the aegis of MeitY held stakeholder consultation in March 2022 towards finalization of the directions.
Yeah.
Now,
so
that is what they mentioned.
Yeah. So the scenario that I mentioned may or may not have happened.
May or may not have happened. So, I mean, it's a hypothetical question.
And I gave a hypothetical answer.
Yeah, it's ambiguous. Thanks.
So let's move on from the lack of public consultation and perhaps a lack of broad private consultation also.
Just one more thing on that, Nikhil. So one of the things that the Minister of State said was, we do not need to hold public consultation on this because the common man is not impacted by it. So if anyone wants to take
Himanshi, would you like to take a stab at that? How are small businesses and how are citizens impacted by this?
Citizens, I can't comment on, thanks. But small businesses, first of all, I don't think, little few small businesses we spoke to are clueless about what's going on and how does it even, connect with what they do. So, but you have to realize that most small businesses don't think about security beyond, ensuring that they don't get viruses in their system and so on. But that's the reality. It's a huge gap between what the big guys do and what happens on the ground with more than the 63 million SMEs that are there. I'm guessing at least the ones in the non-regulated sectors. So, but the ones, let's forget about the ones who are clueless. But even amongst the rest, I think people are trying to make sense of what is expected of them. This precise thing of trying to clear the confusion between what needs to be reported, what needs to actually, how do they need to report it, and so on and so forth. Most of them are waiting for guidances from, the larger guys. Many of the small guys are service providers or vendors to larger organizations. So they kind of rely on the larger organizations to give them more direction. And the general consensus is that let's wait and watch amongst the smaller.
Okay. Thanks, Shivangi. So moving on.
If I may, I just wanted to, I have a comment on what Nikhil said about stakeholder consultation. I mean, Nikhil's hypothetical is almost believable, except for this one small part that it does not appear likely that stakeholder consultation included anyone who has actually done digital forensics or incident response themselves. Because if I've done that, and I can tell you, when I roll up my sleeves and get into a proper IR project, it's not all madness. There's a method, and the method is fairly simple. You communicate, you comply, and then you investigate. It's a three-step process. CERT's guidelines are all about the third and probably the least important part of this process. And this is pretty much how you do an incident response, whether it's in the US or in Europe. This is more or less the standard, right? I mean, and for CERT to not talk about communication or compliance and jump directly into doing stuff that might help forensics, I mean, I don't know who they spoke to, but it's just not there.
Well, I think you're just reiterating the point that had there been a public consultation, there would have been more useful views, more from a technology side that they would have received as responses probably. Also from a legal perspective, because, I'm not sure how enforceable these rules are, how practical these rules are, because to have that kind of a timeline of it for everyone to report on, it means that most people are going to be in violation of these guidelines, and that's bad law. If you're going to create a situation where everyone with the website will have to be compliant with these guidelines, including a sole proprietorship, then you're going to find that a majority of this country is going to be in violation. That means that the law is flawed, and the expectation from the law from people is just unrealistic.
And
I mean, so when you deal with these incidences, how feasible is a 6-hour timeline according to you? I mean, is it possible even for people to know whether an incident is an incident within that time frame? Reasonably, okay. At a very small organization level, maybe a 15 people, 10 people company?
First of all, and I think the problem is in the language that says suspected events. And as you correctly point out, you don't know until and unless you've spent like a day or two, even the best of the best. And, so I was with this tech MNC, one of the tech giants, working with the tech giants about 8 or 10 years back when they were hit by this APT. It took us weeks to even figure out how bad the whole infection was. So 6 hours is not, and 6 hours is simply not feasible even for large organizations. And I'm going to give you a small example. Take a look at Bangladesh Central Bank. They were hacked over a weekend. See, your attackers will do due diligence. They'll figure out when your employees are going to go home over a long weekend, and that is when they're going to mount your attack. So 6 hours, this sort of deadlines really do not do much in terms of strengthening your security posture. Does that answer your question?
I don't know.
I mean, you're just putting pressure on the smaller guys.
I don't think they'll be able to comply.
Yeah.
Savish?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the impact on smaller business, I think, is one I think the biggest takeaway from here. But just moving on from the 6-hour reporting and then looking at it from a global context and situating India in that, how does other countries deal with it? If Sukanya and then Srinidhi after that, if you can talk more about what do we see in other countries in terms of cybersecurity norms, reporting timeline, logging requirements, anything of that sort, which is comparable to what India has?
Yeah, hi Sarvesh, hi Nikhil. So what has come out from my research, governments across the globe, they opt for reporting requirements, and it ranges from 24 to 72 hours. But generally, the kind of approach that government takes is they will look at it from a sector-specific point of view, or they have different sort of approaches on looking at the cybersecurity. So there is consumer-based approaches that FTC takes up in USA. So they look at data and whether how it is going to data breaches and how it is going to impact consumer. So there are a lot of innovative ways how countries are experimenting with this, which we don't really find here. So that's I think something that we should definitely learn from outside countries. Yeah.
Okay, and Srinidhi, anything you've noticed in trends overall?
Sure. Yeah, I think most regions do follow some kind of a impact-based or risk-based approach. How an incident has impacted services, functions, individuals, reach, just the nature of service that you provide. I think the FAQs do try to narrow the scope to 4 categories of incidents: cyber incidents of a severe nature, data breaches and data leaks, large scale or most frequent incidents, and incidents impacting safety, but not a lot of guidance on how to interpret that severity or large scale, and how do organizations make that assessment. I understand other jurisdictions, say, Singapore, Australia, may have sharp timelines, but that's limited to incidents involving critical infrastructure, for instance. Europe has a network and information directive where there's some guidance on what's a significant incident which has to be reported. You look at geographical spread, extent to which functions have been affected, some level of impact assessment. We also came across, instances where, say, Canada, when it's reporting, they have a, cyber management plan for their own government systems, incident response plans, and they come up with like an injury test. You see the level of harm to, say, health and safety of individuals. You see impact to government programs, loss of, so there are some kinds of thresholds and guidance rather than I'd say any and every incident. So it would also be useful to understand what sort of, if there is a link to, of course, critical infrastructure, then perhaps makes sense to include that within the threshold. But some guidance as to what is even, say, most frequent or large scale would be useful here.
Just wanted to add actually to what Srini, and I completely agree with what Srinidhi and Shivangi said, that there should be a graded kind of a approach. And globally, what we have seen is, and what we have also been recommending is that there is generally a 72-hour timeline, because that is the minimum it takes to, to assess the situation and internally and see whether it is of whether the severity is critical enough for it to be reported, which makes the system a little more aligned with the global practices. So that is what we have been recommending, A. And B is the overall, I think both Srinidhi and Shivangi were talking about the overall broad definition of incident severity, leaves it, makes it, along with what has been mentioned definitely in the Annexure 1, will result in what companies will be reporting almost all incidents that have not actually resulted in any disruption or loss of service. I'll stop there. I think Sukanya has something to add to that.
Just to add to that, another question that I had for all of you is, what purpose does a 6-hour time frame serve, given that it's a tight timeline? What purpose does that serve when it's related to non-critical data or non-critical infrastructure, non-sensitive data and non-critical infrastructure? Sukanya, sorry, that.
I just wanted to make a limited point that when government approaches cybersecurity incident reporting from sector analysis, sector-wise segregation, if they do, or they do it as a segregation based on severity, it also helps the government to have a better analysis of what kind of threats are emanating in which sector. So maybe a power sector is more critical in our jurisdiction, or they can make that kind of assessment and then come out with certain sort of policy. And that's how government across other jurisdictions are doing the same, especially and it's true for all the governments that they generally don't have resources to assess everything on their own. There has to be a collaborative approach, and I think 6 hour this hourly reporting thing, I think it feeds into that thing. So they should have, I think, in my opinion, they should have really thought it from that perspective, that something that would help them to assess cybersecurity landscape in India better and then formulate better policies around that.
Thanks, Sukanya. Srinidhi, when you're coming back to this comparison that we made with other jurisdictions, so other countries also have CERT. They have their own computer emergency response teams. Do these CERTs have similar powers as India's CERT in terms of CERT over here can issue directions, and these directions are kind of broad. They can demand information for any investigation. Do other CERTs have similar power?
I do actually. I don't specifically know the answer to that, but I do believe similar nodal agencies have powers to call for information. There are definitely regulators, even data protection regulators, if it is personal data that's involved, who do have certain oversight powers, as do sectoral regulators. But I'm actually not very clear on the specifics there on other sorts.
Okay. I think
Sarvesh, if I may, I just butt in here again. So it depends on geography. For example, Israeli CERT, I would say, has a lot more authority in investigating breaches, whereas the Dutch CERT, they're probably one of the finest when it comes to incident response and general forensics. They use a more collaborative approach. So even they don't really have they whenever there's an incident, they would proactively reach out to impacted organizations, help them out. So that whole burden of regulation does not even arise, because organizations know that these guys are trying to help us, so they're almost always welcome. It depends on geography, so to speak.
Yeah. The reason I brought this point was because the Internet Society's report has a good point. They say that by acting as somewhat like a law enforcement agencies with these new requirements, they actually scare away companies from reporting rather than just performing their function as a incident response team. That's why I brought this up. And I think one more thing over here is now there was a recent report that CERT might be exempted from RTI. So there's no way to even hold CERT accountable or get any information. So should CERT have that national security, the national security reason to be exempted from RTI? What do you think? Sukanya, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so cybersecurity or national security, generally, I'll have a very general answer to this. So national security or cybersecurity sits very uniquely in our legal framework. So it is something that is impacting a lot of people, and there's a lot less information available about it. But at the same time, judiciary also exercises substantial restraint in dealing with these things. So on justification part, I think they might be able to do it, because over years we have seen that national security sector enjoys a lot more exemptions. But yeah, so this certainly is a concerning thing, but I don't think how we can counter this. This is something that government has to understand, and I think if they look at cybersecurity from collaborative perspective, they would formulate better strategies around it.
Okay. I saw some interesting conversation on the chat window, so I just want to talk about that. So someone just pointed out that the way to report incidents is through a PDF. And now where do we sit, like, in terms of the global standards? What do other countries report in PDF? And if not, what's the best way to report incidents? Suman, if you want to answer that.
It's not even a PDF form, it's not like you can fill it on your laptop. You have to take a printout. And by the way, it's out of date. So, the PDF form that they have does not even have the entire list of incidents that they want us to report. Typically, if you're looking at some of the larger countries, some of the more cyber aware and cyber capable countries, they'll typically have an online submission mechanism. They will also typically have encrypted email, and I think some of them also have. The US definitely. They also support incident response incident reporting via telephone. So there will be multiple channels open to anyone who wants to report an incident, and it won't be something as onerous as taking a printout and then scanning it back and sending an email.
Okay. And so when another question related to this reporting, and now they have this 180 days of log requirement, right? And if there's any incident that they want the logs for, they can request the logs. To my understanding, these logs are going to be in terabytes of size. What's the logistics here? How are these logs going to be reported? What format? In 6 hours, how do you send a 5 TB file? How does it going to work?
Well, from a technical point of view, if you have enough bandwidth, you probably can do that transfer. But I don't think the intent of the 6-hour window is to share every single facet of information that might be useful in the investigation. Has to be shared. I don't think that is the case. Rather, I think it's more about letting CERT know, okay, we've been hit, or we think we might have been breached, and then CERT-In can probably, take their own sweet time and get back that, hey, do this, do that, and that's what I think the 6-hour reporting window is about.
Right, but are the 180 days of logs necessary? Like, what's the industry standard?
So that's a very good question, Nikhil. If you are dealing with some of the most advanced strains of ransomware, or some of the more lethal APTs, and if you're dealing with a situation like the Kaseya incident that happened, you are probably going to need logs for the last 2 years. Okay, but does every single company need to have logs of every single application running on every single device? The answer is no. You need to figure out what are the crown jewels in your network are, and then you need to have logs for specific applications that are running on these crown jewels. Okay.
Right, but the guidelines specifically mention that this needs to be on, and this applies to organizations with any ICT system. And I'm just wondering about, does that mean that every single server, device, application, everything that you use needs to, one, generate logs, and then you need to find a central repository where all of those logs will be stored? How feasible is this kind of an activity for the business? And I'd like Shivangi to also maybe talk a little bit about this, and maybe Srinidhi as well after that.
Right. So, it's feasible for some of the larger organizations, and they probably already do that to a certain extent. Okay. And if you look at the FAQ clarification document that has come up, you'll see that CERT is talking about firewalls and network-related applications. So they have cut down the scope of logging to a certain extent. But to mandate a flat 180-day window for every single organization does not make sense. Again, I would be going back to what I was saying earlier. So when you start looking at security, you start with a threat model. And every sector, as Srinidhi has been saying and Sukanya has been saying, every sector probably has their own threat model. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to cybersecurity. So you're probably doing this incorrectly. And even if it's possible, it is going to slow down your service response time. So it's a net loss for your customer.
And a net increase in cost as well.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you have to localize. And, if you look at how data center or, cloud storage pricing is done, you would see that cloud storage in India is far more expensive than what it would be, let's say, if you were using a server somewhere in northwestern US.
Well, in fact, cloud service providers in India, given the compliance requirements that are going to hit them, are considering increasing prices anyway. So the costs are going to increase for business overall. But Shivangi, you're working with small businesses. What's What's the take on the 180 days logging, and how does it work for them?
See, I'm going to take a leaf out of what Suman said, which is that you need to identify your crown jewel. Essentially, what he said, and connecting back to what Srinidhi and Sukanya were talking about also, is everything comes down to prioritization and risk assessment. Finally, the risk associated with something, and everybody builds their security programs based on risk. So you obviously put in a lot more resources in protecting and managing your crown jewels than you would with somebody else, right? And on another note, and then I'll connect the two. On another note, if you look at SIEM systems, a lot of them finally begin with logs, right? A large chunk of information comes from logs as well as from everywhere else. So they have their own evolved over a period of time, what works best, what doesn't. So I agree with Suman when he says that just having a blanket black and white 180 days thing may not always work. There has to be some other way of approaching this, keeping the spirit of the requirement in mind, which is the spirit seems to be that, hey, I need access to logs to help you assess what really went wrong, and then kind of make sure it doesn't happen with other organizations and so on, right? Because that is the spirit of the whole thing. Coming specifically to small businesses, so the good news I would say with most SMBs today is that, except for the legacy ones, most organizations tend to use a lot of stuff on the cloud, right? So they are not really hosting systems of their own beyond the absolutely mandated and something that they build for themselves, maybe a platform, maybe a product, where of course everything is sort of sorted. Otherwise, all the other stuff that helps you run your business happens to be cloud-based systems, with SaaS providers and others, where then the headache of managing all this is actually with them. So, logs and stuff like that. So the problem is transferred to somebody else, not per se within that community. But if they were to do it on their own, I feel, resources in terms of skills to do it, the ability to have solutions to do it, basically what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and then ensuring it gets done. The kind of budgets that one is talking about may not be something which is, within the scope of small and micro, I would say. I won't include the mid over there. But again, in non-regulated sectors rather than in regulated sectors.
Shivangi, what are we looking at in terms of cost? If small business had to comply with this directive, what kind of budget are we looking at compared to the present?
It would depend on the kind of business they run, right? So for example, if it is a completely let's say an IT services company or a KPO or BPO, there is very little internal systems that they work with. They just have basic email and maybe stuff around HR and all of that. And a lot of it these days, even the ones who started with doing stuff in-house, HR, accounting, all of that is pushed onto the cloud now. And otherwise they're working off client systems. So for them, the cost of compliance is not going to be significantly higher than what they're doing today. But if it's, let's say, a SaaS-based company or a fintech kind of company where they have, I'm using the same term, crown jewels, then they would need to invest in some sort of a security operations and monitoring mechanism, either whether it's outsourced, whether it's in-house. And finally, the cost just comes to managing that. But even before that, putting in place processes to manage it and stuff like that, I think I can't put a figure to it because it would be very different for somebody which is a 15-person organization than someone else who's a 500-person organization, and then within which what kind of business they run. So and finally, when it comes to doing some of this, there is what is called risk-based assessment and cost-benefit assessment, right? So a lot of times people look at the costs and say, hey, let me just outsource everything. Let me not even bother with doing this in-house and pay for it. In which case, a lot of costs go down.
Srinidhi, I'm just curious about who this impacts from a global perspective. So if there is a business that's servicing Indian customers, let's say a MailChimp, right, which is the emailing software that many of us use, does this impact them in any way? do they then have to store logs for 180 days in India, localize them? Do they have to comply with the 60-day reporting mechanism because they have customers in India? How does this work? Like, does every app in the world have to now abide by these guidelines because of the nature of who they target?
I believe that kind of goes to the question of extraterritorial applicability of the IT Act. I think that's Section 75, if I'm not mistaken, which has fairly broad language about if you use a computer service network resource in India, the IT Act and corresponding rules presumably do then kind of trigger for you. I know some of the newer rules, like the intermediary guidelines, when they came out last year, had that threshold of if there is a systematic activity that you're undertaking. It's not each and every sort of news publisher, but there has to be some reference point, some sort of trigger, and I do wonder if that might be the more reasonable interpretation.
No, because I'm asking because ExpressVPN has pulled its servers from India, and Tracker has just reported like an hour or so ago that according to certain IT ministry, I forget which, they're saying that irrespective of whether they move the servers out of India or not, they still have to abide by these guidelines because they're serving Indian customers. So if it applies to ExpressVPN, it pretty much applies to every tech business in the world that has Indian users. And given the fact that we have the second highest number of internet users in the world, it applies to every internet business in the world, effectively.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, it is a fairly wide reading of the law, and I saw Surfshark, a couple of other folks have also, raised concerns on whether we can even provide services in India going forward, because India is a target market of sorts. There are users who are using it from here, so I do think that it impacts, like it does have far-reaching impact.
Sadesh?
Yeah, I think so. I'm wondering. So if with these VPNs, right, and not just VPNs, all these companies, what's the capacity for CERT to monitor the compliance? Do they have the resources to monitor compliance? Because we're looking at a lot of companies here who might not be able to comply with these directions, right? If anyone wants to answer that, like how is the compliance going to work?
Okay, so I don't want to answer this, but I want to do a hypothetical a la Nikhil. Look at what Brazil did, and they brought in their version of GDPR, and one of the first things they did was they slapped a fine on WhatsApp. And Russia has done something similar. They've imposed fines on VPN service providers and also a couple of social media giants. So maybe that's one line of revenue you don't want to miss out. And you really don't care, if the mom and pop shop gets popped or not.
And we also have like a lot of not a lot of companies, but VPN providers specifically saying that they will legally challenge this directive. Srinidhi, if you can talk more about other grounds to legally challenge. If so, what grounds are there for companies?
Sure. Yeah, I think just maybe a little bit on the legal power and source of the direction. So, CERT was set up under the IT Act through the 2008 amendment. The IT Act says that the government can prescribe rules to describe how CERT will perform its functions and all of that. And it also says that CERT has certain number of functions, which is fairly wide, again, collecting, analysis, dissemination of information about cyber incidents, forecasts and alerts of cybersecurity incidents, and they can issue directions to service providers, body corporate, any other person to carry out these functions. So that's where CERT is sort of tracing its powers to. Now, while issuing directions, I guess like any other branch of the government, CERT must also abide by and ensure that anything that kind of restricts, say, fundamental rights is reasonable, and that the restrictions are reasonable. So perhaps I think on the VPN piece, there's been some concerns around just privacy as well. Perhaps a potential challenge is on privacy. One of the directions asks VPN service providers to collect all of this information about customers, validated information, period of hire, IP addresses, email addresses, validated contact numbers, All of these also have to be maintained for a period of 5 years, and something like this then must, I believe, meet that 3-part test which was laid down in Puttaswamy of legality, necessity, and proportionality, which means you must have a legitimate state objective. You must show that the restriction has a connection to the objective. There aren't lesser intrusive means of doing the same thing. It's proportionate. I guess here the objective is to trace like nefarious activities and perhaps sources of cyber incidents, ransomware, and so on. But questions around whether the direction is too wide to then meet that objective. Are we presuming that anyone who's using a VPN is using it for something, well, nefarious here? It does strike at some core privacy principles, perhaps like data minimization, which says you should minimize the amount of data that you collect, don't retain it for longer than needed. I think in the Aadhaar challenge as well, when I think in the 2016 authentication regulation said that authentication records must be kept for a period of 5 years, and the Supreme Court had said you shouldn't keep this longer for than 6 months. So I think just those questions as well might come up, and larger themes around how individuals are interacting with the internet. Is there a right to stay anonymous, use VPN services at all? And I guess to one of yours and Nikhil's earlier questions on if you just meet industry, is that enough consultation here? I mean, I think one could argue that this does also affect individuals and how they access the internet. If you're barring, if you're essentially saying that VPN service providers must maintain a certain type of logs about individuals which are then reportable to CERT and to the government, does it also impact individuals in that way? I guess a couple of other themes could be, I just wonder if I also saw reporting that some of these global VPN service providers have been considering whether to mount a legal challenge to pull out. It does kind of strike at their business model. Can they really carry on business while ensuring user privacy? Although while there is a fundamental right to carry on business, it can be restricted in public interest, but perhaps that's a threat to also think about. I think I'll pause there to see if others have thoughts.
Anyone else wants to add on legal grounds that could be used to challenge the directive? How does it compare? Srinidhi, if you can just ask you one more on this drawing parallels to the IT rules. So one of the IT rules, the part applicable to digital media was, it's right now it's state because it's broad, overbroad, and it goes beyond the Parent Act. So can similar grounds be used here with the directions that it goes beyond the 2013 rules? Is that something that can be done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were discussing this within the team. I don't know if we can talk about whether this goes beyond what the 2013 rules say, because CERT also directly traces its power from the IT Act. They can issue directions to perform their functions better. But I do wonder if the part about it also gets into the directions also ask virtual asset service providers, your exchange providers, custodian wallets to maintain KYC data for a period of 5 years. Typically, KYC requirements are set by for financial sector are set by the RBI under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. So maybe it's important to see the nexus of this particular direction with cybersecurity. The IT Act does allow CERT to do a bunch of things around cybersecurity, but by venturing into KYC territory, how long are you maintaining these records? Are you kind of stepping into a different regulator? I don't know if there is a direct parallel with part 3 of the IL guidelines. So part 3 governs news publishers and publishers of online content, asking them to observe a certain code of ethics. And the Bombay High Court, I believe that's the decision you're talking about, which state the operation of that part of the rules. There, the logic I understand was that these rules are under the IT Act, but the rules also said that news publishers and content publishers must abide by norms laid down by the Press Council of India Act and the Cable TV Regulation Act. But those laws don't say that this should extend to digital news media. And by doing that, are you going beyond what the IT Act allowed you to do? I don't know if that's a direct parallel, but I guess it comes down to the nexus between each of these 6 directions and cybersecurity, because that is sort of CERT's core function and remit.
Okay.
For Shivangi and Sukanya, if you want to just step in on this. The directions also say that any kind of, they point towards the reporting of new kinds of attacks or new kinds of cybersecurity incidents, and amongst those are things like fake mobile apps and any kind of attack on a big data system. How are any of, like, how does none of this is defined in law, is it? Like, and how is one to read these guidelines? Is there too much of arbitrariness that's coming in terms of how CERT is approaching things? I'm just curious about these new definitions that have come in, like fake mobile apps. I was wondering, what is a fake mobile app? Is there a legal definition for it? Big data systems, attacks on big data systems. What is the definition of a big data system? If either if you want to pick it up.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Sukanya.
Yeah, so I don't believe there's a specific definition on these things. And while these directions do seem like a very centralized approach that government is taking, but I don't think that government has something very arbitrary in its mind. I think it's coming halfway because of the inability to assess the landscape and what challenges it poses. It's also because of the limited capacity they have. And I think for most part, they're also trying to figure out what's happening and what kind of intrusions are happening, how they should approach it. So I think it's a mix of situation in here.
Shivangi?
Nikhil, I don't have a direct answer to what the point you raised. I don't have something to add there, but I just wanted to talk about something slightly different. See, we've been focusing so far on the compliance aspect, right? CERT-In, and its compliance and what it would take, etc. I want to bring in another angle, and maybe feel free to tell me it is out of scope or context. See, one of the things that what we've been seeing is that most large organizations really struggle with what is called third-party risk management, right? I mean, they do everything within their scope, but because there are so many vendors and third parties who are plugged into their network, who tend to be the long tail of small companies, most of who don't have adequate systems in place to manage security, and so therefore the threat that they face from third parties is significant. It gives most CISOs sleepless nights. Right now, if you look at especially the unregulated sector, there is nobody telling the SMB, look guys, you have to do this. It is not just about yourself, but it is about what your customers look for, and it impacts the country also overall. Right now, the only way to push people to do things is when there is some sort of a stick, right? And compliance is the stick that is used in many ways. So if I take 25 steps back and don't, without looking at the details of how, why, etc., that this is going to happen, if this is going to be the stick that is going to push people to at least implement something from a larger good perspective, I think for that alone I would give it points. Because it is not so much about it's not only about today it's not only about me and my company, but it is about the larger impact that it has as well.
But the impact that it has is on individuals. It is effectively
Finally
putting an enforcement mandate on individuals, including those who are in no position to comply with it.
See, that's another myth, right? That compliance
do you think that a 6-hour timeline is fine for a person who's just running a website and his WordPress is outdated and it gets breached using a bot? Sometimes it might take them weeks to identify that this has happened, even though they might have gotten an email that may have gone, indicating that there is a potential for a breach.
Correct.
I mean, from a practical operational perspective, there are two things that I have challenges with. Number one, some of these phrases are so broad that it creates a massive amount of arbitrariness an arbitrary power, like a power for arbitrariness with CERT-In regarding whom they want to go after and whom they don't. Right?
Absolutely.
So that's one. So the other thing is that it is creating compliances. Like, we are going to struggle with this compliance. We are a very small organization. We are going to struggle with this kind of a compliance because quite often when something happens, it's just very difficult to understand what exactly has even happened. I mean, Suman can talk about, how complex is it, Suman, to distinguish between an actual incident and something that one believes is an incident. Like, how complex is from a technical perspective to actually understand whether something is a legitimate cybersecurity incident according to these definitions.
So you know how police investigations go, right? Every death is a homicide until it's ruled out. So it's similar in cybersecurity. Why? Because there's this thing called dwell time. As in, malicious adversaries will not always get in your system and start causing disruptions. They're going to sit there for the next 1 year or so and bide their time when to really hit you, right? So you wouldn't know, and I wouldn't know. I mean, if I said that I would be able to, tell apart every event as with 100% success rate, whether it's going to be a breach or not, I'd be lying.
Which means, to be on the safe side, you start reporting everything as an incident.
There you go.
And on an average, how many so-called incidents do companies have to deal with? Maybe a mid-sized company have to deal with in a year.
It's very hard to say. It's very hard to say. I'll tell you why. Because with the advent of cloud computing, what's happening is you are no longer limited to the number of human beings you employ, and you can simply spin up hundreds and thousands of devices in with one click, right? So that increases your attack surface. You getting my point, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, it is extremely difficult to come up with a number. It'd be in the millions probably.
In the millions overall. So therefore,
For a meeting.
So I'm just wondering whether CERT-In has the capacity to deal with 1 million reports in a year.
Maybe
what has your experience been with reporting of incidences to CERT-In? How soon are they able to respond to something? What is CERT-In's response time?
They respond?
What is their response time?
No, I'm asking you. So I didn't know this. Do they respond?
I guess the question answers itself. When CERT-In, does CERT-In have the capacity that they're expecting others to have? Is the question.
So CERT-In's job is not to investigate every single breach, or they're not supposed to help out every single organization. At least that's not how CERTs operate. CERT's mandate, and CERT is CERT is not necessarily a government thing. There are private organizations in the US, and then there are universities which have their own CERTs. So CERT is just one team that you have who looks into all the up and coming incidents as well as vulnerabilities and provide, and their job is to provide you with guidelines on how to mitigate threats that you face or prepare for potential threats that might hit you. I think what CERT is trying to do, CERT-In here is trying to do, is a lot without necessarily having the bandwidth or budget or even resources to pull it off. I mean, they really need to focus on what their scope should be. I think this is an issue of scope.
So I think we should take some of the questions that have come in. Sarvesh, do you have anything that you want to pull up?
Yeah, let me just take a look. I think we answered most of these actually in the question and answers. The ExpressVPN, stakeholder consultations.
So the question, how do we understand the phrase public information infrastructure mentioned in the first bullet in the answer to question 30 in the FAQs? I ask because there are no judgments or definitions to help us understand this phrase. Any of the lawyers want to take that? Are there many things that are undefined in law in these rules? Srinidhi?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to define public information infrastructure. I wonder if it's, I don't believe that it's used interchangeably with critical information infrastructure because the rest of the piece doesn't necessarily talk about only critical. There are several, I think, just data breaches, data leaks, severe nature, large scale. I do think there are a fair few number of things which are open to sort of interpretation, but typically I believe how this would work is if there are some guardrails or if there is some at least factors for you to determine what might trigger some of these thresholds of say data leak or of large scale as well. If there are a bunch of factors, like I'm thinking in the something like number of people that it's affected, nature of service, those type of factors would perhaps help contextualize these. But I don't believe that there is existing case law which might clarify, but I might be wrong here.
I think one of the parts of the directive that we haven't got into yet, and which has been actually gaining much of the attention, is the requirement to synchronize clocks with servers of NTP servers of NIS and the National Physics, NIC and the National Physics Laboratory. That's a point that most companies also objected to. If Kumar, you can talk a little bit about why companies are objecting to that time synchronization bit, and then if Suman, you can get into the technicality of what this whole requirement entails, that'll be great.
See, while they, I will jump straight into the FAQ document. So while they tried to clarify that it could, they mentioned that organizations are allowed to use a standard time source other than the National Physical Lab and the National Informatics Center, as long as the accuracy of time maintained is maintained by ensuring that the time source used conforms to time provided by NTP servers of NPL and NIC. That is what they said. Now, what we are, or what the associations have been saying is that what if the NTP servers are not synced with everyone else's? What happens then? Therefore, that synchronization piece is a little confusing, even though they tried to sort it out in the FAQ document. But I will also let others, as you rightly pointed out, with a legal background to jump in and see what they have to say.
Suman, if you want to talk about why it's confusing, why this whole time synchronization aspect is a little complex.
Okay. So time is a hard problem, and it's been one of the finest examples of what we can achieve. Syncing time across the internet has been one of the finest examples of what we humans can achieve in terms of solving a complex problem in a distributed manner. Right? It's a stellar example. That said, when we say we are going to sync our system's time with a server, with another server that's located probably halfway across the world, we don't mean that we are going to get married to the server. It's not a till death do us part situation. It's more like a best friends forever situation. You hang out often enough, you talk about things, but then you go about your different ways. And CERT-In's language shall not deviate puts a spanner in this whole way the thing works, right? You cannot simply say shall not deviate and then not explain how companies are going to achieve that. The way the network time protocol works is that you talk to at least three sources, three different time sources, and you come up with a I would say, you come up with this complicated average time that you use. And because your system can have its own idiosyncrasies, it can go, it will probably not be in lockstep with these time sources that you've been using. So, you check back again in about, a few minutes or a few hours. So there's this entire window that you can use. So it's between, I think, 8 minutes and 36 hours. So you can choose pretty much any time in between these two extremes and do a resync. So this is pretty much how the network time protocol thing works. CERT-In's direction, unfortunately, does not seem to take into account the finer nuances of the protocol that the software has to manage or take care of, okay, which is what makes the whole directive extremely difficult to implement. Now that's one part, that's the protocol, that's the technology related issue. There are other issues also. For example, the tooling that we use to typically sync time, it's not, it's not a curl that everyone uses to download files. It's this, there's this very small set of tools that you use for syncing time. They're called NTP-Q and NTP-Trace, but these tools are not used by a lot of people, so obviously they're not as sharp as they could be. There are a number of bugs, and then because time is such a complex thing, interpreting the results from those tools itself requires some level of expertise. So if you now, throw this problem, throw this challenge out onto the open to everyone, that, you go sync, most of the people are going to, well, not know what to do. And even if they have some idea, they'll probably do it wrong because they'll not know how to interpret the results of the tools, output of the tools. I think and the IETF has been talking about NTP best practices for the last couple of decades at least, and they've had this BCP document. It's a best current practice document, and BCP 38 specifically talks about NTP, and in fact it became an RFC document in 2019. So CERT-In could easily have said that, we would like organizations to implement RFC 8633, and that would be the end of the discussion about NTP. There wouldn't be this confusion that we have right now.
How does this RFC 8633 address the synchronization issue? What does it propose as the ideal way to keep clocks synchronized?
Again, it says don't use one, don't use two. I mean, one is, again, when you're talking about fail-safe system, you typically wouldn't want just one. You wouldn't want to depend on just one source, right? And the problem with two sources is that, you'll never know which one is correct. So you have to go with three or more, and then there are different algorithms that you can choose. So it's a pretty big document. I mean, I won't be able to summarize everything here, but I'm saying it's not as restrictive as the CERT guideline. So it says that, here's your window, choose any time between, a few minutes to a day and a half, and you'll be okay.
I have a question for Kumar.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Kumar. Kumar, there's a question from Gangesh, and who doesn't want to come on and ask this question, but in case anyone who's attending wants to comment or ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you in. Gangesh asks, how does it work or differ for singular incidents versus a continuous or multiple incidents? Will when you are notified or discover the first incident in a series, or when the last one in a continuous incident, so if there's a continuous incident, then will you have to notify when you get the first notification about that incident, or the last, or each? It can be complicated, right, from a technical perspective. So what's RTI, what's ITI looked at in terms of incident reporting, in terms of continuous incidences?
So we have not specifically mentioned not just ITI, but the several associations who have written. So we have not really gone into too much of technical details, because that is one of our primary asks, that you should have a technical consultation, which I highlighted towards the beginning of this conversation as well, that CERT-In should have a proper technical discussion so that the technical experts, maybe the CISOs, can come in and highlight the practical aspects of this kind of a reporting. But from an incident reporting perspective, I mean, and the 6 hour, as I mentioned earlier, the 6 hour timeline, even though the FAQ document tries to address that what can be considered to be a severe incident, but it is too broad a definition, which leaves too much to interpretation. And as towards the beginning of this discussion, I think many of the other panelists were also mentioning as to what should be reported, how it should be reported, which incident needs to be reported, or which event needs to be reported, whether events need to be reported or incidents need to be reported. So I think some of those questions were answered, but we have not gone into too much of technical details. But I will see if anybody else has any technical expertise to add to that.
I'm curious because I just saw a comment from Joe. Joe, you want to come in and answer this?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm not, I think I'll be a little cute and say that given the lack of clarity here, I think CERT-In may need to change its name to uncertain, right? It's so hard to tell. And like, I didn't even think about this. And Suman is very right in that 6 hours into an incident, you're still, sweating deep into and you may not have kicked them out of your system yet, and you may have no idea. And so I don't know. I would think that the set of documents that release both the directive and the FAQ don't give much good guidance. And I have a feeling CERT-In is going to have a number of incidents where entities show up with, hey, we discovered this thing 6 hours. We don't know what the heck's going on. Here's the stuff you want. And that level of uncertainty can be really dangerous because, as we've been saying in the comments, there may be evidence of vulnerabilities that apply not just to that one entity. Often, how we use computers, right? A vulnerability found in one system can be easily repurposed in many others. And it's just unclear to what extent you will know if that severity of information is contained within what you're disclosing. So I'm not sure if I have any particularly profound thoughts other than, wow, is it unclear what anyone should do. And I operate a website that has some connections to India, but I just have no idea. So I apologize, I can't.
Great, welcome to
Shed
India.
more
You're now
light.
covered by our compliance.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else want to address this about the reporting requirements? Great. I wanted to check a little bit about the privacy side of things. If someone wants to talk about, because we really haven't talked about privacy here, right? How is privacy being impacted for consumers? Srinidhi, Shivangi, Sukanya, any of you want to talk about privacy?
I think coming at it from multiple angles. One is, what in the information that is being shared as part of reporting, how much of personal data is really being shared, right? Because that's where the scope will come in. And if there is, and log files do have personal data. So as long as that, the same, it doesn't get used for a different purpose and there is evidence to show that it is not getting used for a different purpose, then I don't see an issue from a privacy perspective per se, which is a red flag. However, I did see some of the questions that were being discussed about this and, violation of GDPR and so on and so forth. I actually looked up the, standard contractual clauses released a while ago by the GDPR, by the EU, to just to correlate what we kind of know is that anybody can report and share information with a public authority in their respective country, just that they need to inform the controller that this information is being shared. That's what the clauses say. So I don't see really any kind of an issue from a GDPR perspective, and similarly from other laws. Srinidhi, you can probably add more clarity on this aspect.
Sure. Yeah, I think a couple of things that I mentioned earlier was just the report, actually not the reporting requirements, but the maintaining logs is one bit, and also maintaining other information for VPN providers, validated information about individuals, IP addresses, email addresses, validated address and contact numbers, and asking for these to be retained for a 5-year period. So whether there is some, rationale for having a 5-year retention period for such kind of information, and also this is requiring them to maintain all of this. So kind of goes against your data minimization, general core privacy principle of data minimization.
But you can say that from a payment, like if you look at the payments industry, it's to play devil's advocate here. They're required to store the same data.
Yes.
So what's wrong with having similar data being stored by other entities?
No, I think there the idea is that it goes to sort of money laundering and PMLA, those kind of requirements where certain reported entities. So you have a money trail. You know who's kind of transacting on the internet. I think here the question is also on imposing certain obligations on VPN service providers, which other laws don't currently provide for, and asking them to maintain these types of details.
It's also being asked for all data centers and cloud services as well, right?
Yes, yes.
So 2 questions around that. One, how does one verify and validate customer information? Are you going to now require KYCing of anyone who works with the cloud company, and so therefore, will I be required to do Aadhaar authentication because I'm working with a cloud service provider that's hosting MediaNama? So that's one. And 2, how does this impact foreign entities that might want to host their services in India and use India's cloud infrastructure? Will Indian cloud companies also have to validate them? And then, so therefore, is that going to lead to an increase in KYC costs? And therefore, or will they have to get an Aadhaar? Sorry, ignore my Aadhaar jokes. Okay, I just like to make them all the time. But how will you do validation?
No, that will remain an open question. I think the FAQs also don't, unfortunately, provide much clarity on that. One question.
I mean, we might as well junk the FAQs, right, Srinidhi? I mean, they're not legally binding, so they're not worth the paper that they're printed on us, so to speak, right?
Because I think there's one. The reason why these FAQs seem to be problematic is there's one. So the directive itself says that logs have to be stored in India. And there's a question in the FAQ which asks, does it have to be stored in India? And the answer is, no, it can be stored abroad as long as it does not affect CERT's investigative process.
So am I now supposed to assume what CERT's investigative process is going to involve? Sorry, Srinidhi, I interrupted you, but I'm a little confused about all of this stuff right now.
No, not at all, not at all. That's fine. And I hear you. I think, the FAQs themselves very blatantly say that this is not legal documentation and you can't really rely on it. But I would say, I know, the directions are law and the rules are law. The FAQs, in an ideal scenario, if they were supplementing or clarifying just certain pieces that maybe we could still take some comfort there. Our discomfort is more when they make substantive changes to the scope at times, like the directions say report these 20 incidents mandatorily within 6 hours, whereas the FAQs say report these 4 sets of incidents within 6 hours. So can you then only rely on, as unclear as those might also be, but can you still rely on the FAQs? But I'd still kind of refer back because it does give you a sense of what the government's thinking might have been. And what is the kind of interpretation that would be more reasonable? But yeah, unfortunately, on the bit about validating customer information, there isn't a lot of clarity there. On the ownership pattern of subscribers, there's just this thing on you maintain basic information about if they're an individual, if they're an association, but not a lot on validating. But I wouldn't
Correct. They've effectively redefined the word pattern, right? In the FAQs, they've redefined what the word pattern means in the FAQs. Because they're asking for just ownership information. That's not necessarily pattern. Pattern under normal circumstances would apply to shareholding structure as an ownership pattern. But in the FAQs, they're saying, oh, we just need shareholder information.
As to what is the nature of your entity.
Yeah, and the key management.
The nature of the entity and key management, yeah.
Or an individual or that.
So that's effectively redefining the word ownership pattern with the in the FAQs document.
There's another question I have on privacy. Is there anything on the 2013 rules or anywhere in the IT Act that says how CERT can use the information that's submitted to them? Can it disclose it to public on its own, or does it have some safeguards on when it can?
I'm just checking if there is anything on. I don't believe there is. I actually don't understand what might be a scenario where this information is disclosed to the public.
In terms of a breach.
I think Sarvesh is asking, is there any purpose limitation on certain collection of data?
Yeah.
Usually, while Srinidhi looks up, usually you have certain, legal basis on which you can collect and process data, which is around, national interest, vital interest, public goods, and so on. So under those heads is where they can process the data. But in terms of disclosing to public, and Srinidhi, you can add to that. It is done if there's cause for harm to a particular individual. I guess from that perspective, they may have I don't know legally whether they have the authority to disclose, but that could be one of the grounds.
Yeah. So it says there are a couple of things that they can do. One is there is a confidentiality general sort of requirement which says you maintain reasonable controls, internal checks to maintain confidentiality of information that you may have received. You shouldn't disclose, by you I mean CERT shouldn't disclose information which leads to identification of an individual without the consent of it says competent courts here, but yeah, essentially avoid divulging information that is that identifies people, and you could disclose general trends. There's no proactive obligation to disclose trends, but you may share or disclose general trends around cybersecurity to promote awareness. And in some instances, there is one sort of final this one which says where it's necessary to to disclose information to relevant stakeholders, and it mirrors some of the requirements like interest in sovereignty or integrity of India, defense of India, security of state. So those sort of national security related pieces there, it says you may disclose relevant information to stakeholders, which I would imagine is sort of government entities and the government ecosystem, to be able to mount a response if that's where it's headed.
I think we can start getting into
I just chime in once. I think so. If I were to take a pragmatic look at what will happen, I think the most likely privacy breach will happen because CERT is it's because CERT will try to be extra helpful and provide you with, say, some screenshot of an indicator of compromise that will contain a fragment of a log file that will have some PII, and that's how we'll probably see a breach more than CERT proactively sharing data with other government organizations.
Okay. I think we'll get into recommendations of what can be done. Kumar, if you want to start, what's your wish list? What should be done going forward?
Hi, thanks, Sarvesh. Very quickly, we would like to have a stakeholder consultation, have some sort of an open house with all the technical experts, the legal experts, as Nikhil was also mentioning, and bring in as much of perspective as possible. So even if you can't get the the whole of the section of the stakeholders, get a substantial portion of it, do a proper open consultation. Till such time, hold on to the directive, or at least extend the timeline for its implementation. I guess as of now, the implementation date is somewhere towards the end of June. So till such time an open consultation is done, even though an FAQ document has been released, even though there has been a press conference, and we are thankful to the government for at least trying to chime in or listen in and coming out with a FAQ document. But as there are challenges to the FAQ documents, as we mentioned earlier. So till such time, hold on to the directive and then hold a proper consultation, as well as have a technical consultation with preferably the technical experts, some of them with international and global experiences, and then revise the directive if required based on the kind of feedback that is received, which is, I think, a fair process of having a policy document. But I will let others chime in, please.
So Kanya, do you want to go? What's your wish list?
Yeah, I don't really have a wish list from government. I think that part has already been covered by my co-panelists. Something that I want to add, that the CERT direction should not be seen in isolation with what is our policy making approaches in digital ecosystem. So something that I wanted to share here is that currently there's an ongoing process happening at the UN. So under UN Third Committee, an ad hoc committee has been established, which is looking into formulating a comprehensive treaty on cybercrime. And there are a lot of conversations happening on, there are some proposals on table that indicate that there could be legal liability on the private actors that are involved. So the approach that CERT-In is taking, you cannot really dismiss it. I think some part of it is justified because they don't really get a lot of coordination from private part. But as a policymaker, you and I can do, and maybe industry can also weigh in here, is how to reduce the distrust between the public and the private sector. That is something that has not really come out. And this is the kind of sentiment that India shows in its digital policy making is shared across developing countries. So this is something that you would find in the submissions of a lot of South Asian countries, that also includes South African countries. So that is something that I think we should take away, and we should try to figure out how we can reduce this gap of like this sort of distrust between the public sector and the government sector.
A point you made just reminded me about this national cybersecurity strategy that was supposed to come out sometime last year, I think. Does anyone know what's the status of that cybersecurity strategy?
It's stuck with the cabinet, and it's stuck with the cabinet. That's where it is. I don't think it'll ever see the light of day. At the time when that policy had been submitted, the rumors were that again, there's going to be a compliance officer, and that will have to be appointed for cybersecurity within each company. That was a rumor, and it's in line with other policies that are, like putting a grievance officer or a compliance officer for various other IT-related stuff. So, as someone once said on a discussion we had, the government needs a throat to choke, which means they need someone to catch. You're going to have someone to choke for privacy, someone to catch for cybersecurity, various other aspects. So, but that policy, I don't know if we'll ever see a cybersecurity policy. If we do, they'll have to begin that process again, because it's been what I think that started in December 2018. So it's already too late. Policy making is too slow.
Sukanya, do you want to add?
Yeah, just another thing, that apart from the multi-stakeholder approach that government should take in cybersecurity issues, because this is something which is too big to be handled by just one party. government has an edge when because it understands cybersecurity from a strategic point of view, but at the same time, the commercial aspect is more something that industry understand. Another thing that I would want to incorporate here, that next time whenever government approaches cybersecurity policy making, capacity building and technical assistance is something they should definitely look in for, and find more ways to interact with private sector and strengthen their core areas. So I think that could be one starting point that government can think of.
Sumin, your wish list?
Wish list wise, I would say the first thing would be to cut down on scope. It's too broad right now. So, for example, if you look at the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, it's broader than GDPR, right? I mean, so if CERT thinks that they can throw in a single line and regulate AI, well, then we are in for a very difficult time. So I would say yes, cutting down on scope is important, and I think it's also important to reuse what we already have. For example, I spoke about the NTP related RFC. So there are standards out there that we can reuse rather than reinvent the wheel. So, and third, I would definitely say, we need to have a conversation, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation because the threat landscape keeps evolving very fast.
Shivangi, recommendations?
I would say relook at the guidelines, have them, the timelines for reporting, 6 hours, and have them graded. As somebody mentioned during the panel discussion, make them risk-based, so that, so you're not jumping for everything. Second is lot more in-depth clarity needs to be brought out in terms of who needs to do what at what juncture. It's very, very high level at this point in time. And a lot more awareness amongst all the stakeholders who are impacted by this. I mean, you can't just release something on the net and expect everybody to understand what is being discussed.
Srinidhi?
Yeah, I think a lot of good points have been made, but I'd say perhaps just having a better threshold for what kind of incidents to be reported and when. More guidance here, like Shivangi said, a graded approach would be useful. And I think also what came out in the conversation was just a more collaborative approach where private entities can work with CERT in managing their response better, because nobody denies that that's a useful objective to have. I mean, I think Suman had also talked about regions where companies are working with the CERTs in their regions and other nodal agency, acknowledging that this is good for both private and for the government. So just perhaps encouraging that, and a starting point for that is, of course, to have consultation on, how the technology really, how it's to be written into the law. I think we've spoken about several instances here where it's simply what the guidelines say are not just unclear, but perhaps it's simply not how the tech will work. So maybe finding a way for having a better conversation where that can be hard-coded into the law.
You have a wish list?
I have a question actually on VPNs. What should the government, what should CERT-In do, and what shouldn't CERT-In do regarding VPNs? Anyone?
I mean, it really depends on what the government thinks the problem with VPNs are.
So unless there's a problem, and so I guess one of the problems is that they haven't identified what are they trying to address. They've just told us what they want us to do.
Correct.
Because I mean, there are other questions. Now they've exempt corporate VPNs. So is this only for what impacts consumers? And are only consumers going to be then, governed by these directions? I have a very simple wish list service, which is scrap these guidelines and start a public consultation. Look, even in the process of these discussions, the one that we've just had, we found something new. Gangesh's question on what do you do about continuous incidents, right? So there are lots of unanswered questions, and those questions will only come up when we have a diverse set of responses from a diverse set of stakeholders. And six people on this discussion, along with 100 or so people on this chat, are still not. It's still not a wide enough net to get all the perspectives you need to make a better decision that impacts this entire country and potentially businesses across the world that service us as consumers in this country. So I think it's myopic, foolish, and terrible policy making to just to come up with guidelines and or come up with a set of direction and just force it on people without taking into account what it means for the entire internet ecosystem, because India is not a country in isolation on the internet. What happens here impacts the rest of the world. What happens in the rest of the world impacts us as well. And if you want to be in a part of the global internet, then we have to work in a manner that we understand how it impacts everyone. And so I just think that it's terrible policy making yet again, and we're seeing multiple policies each year, after every few months, coming in that just come from someone's poor understanding of how things work. I don't claim to know it all. I don't think any of us here does, and which is why exactly we need as many points of view and as many perspectives, especially those coming from experiences. I mean, I wish Tarun Dua had been on this discussion. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here. But the war stories that he has to tell, I mean, ignore Tarun. We held a discussion on cybersecurity in Bangalore. I think it was 5 years ago, and it was under Chatham House, and we had lots of startups come and tell us war stories about how they had been breached and how they dealt with it. None of that makes it public, so I understand the need for there to be information and for consumers to be mandatorily informed when they are breached and when there are incidences, for someone to do something about it. I mean, as a consumer, I'd like to know. But the point is, all of those points of view of people who've dealt with these issues, those need to be incorporated. And that's not going to happen, unless there's a proper consultation and unless all views are taken. So that's my only recommendation, frankly. Scrap these rules and start over.
Thanks, Nikhil. Are we going to have closing remarks, or do we
I think
have
we've got a wish
alcohol
list.
before that? A wish list?
We've got a wish list from everyone, but Sarvesh, what's yours?
I mean, mine is similar to yours. I think withdraw the directive as it is, issue a consultation, but the consultation paper should be made with technical experts. It just shouldn't be like any consultation paper. But apart from that, I think there are some organizational issues that need to be fixed in terms of CERT making sure that it has the capacity to deal with whatever it's going to put out. It's a very underfunded departments of the government. We're trying to get the exact numbers of how much it's getting funded. I filed an RTI about it, but from what I've read other reports, it's one of the underfunded departments. So first they need to get these organizational structures in place before they issue directives. And another thing about the whole time synchronization, again, the infrastructure needs to be there. So India's NTP servers, the government NPL and IC servers need to be robust. And I think the ISOC report says if the servers are robust and if they are of good quality, then computers will naturally start picking up their time from these NTP servers. You don't have to mandate it. So these are some of the other, I think they should zoom out, look at the other larger things to facilitate a directive like this, and then get to the directive and issue the directive.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for a great discussion. Please stay on, because Dr. Johal is going to talk to us about his views on this on the CERT-In consultation and what this means for the internet as a whole. It's one of those. I mean, I was very looking forward to this, Joe, because in India we have this tendency of being very insular and looking at what's impacting us within the country. And sometimes the pace at which the regulations happen and the impact it has on us from a privacy, security, free speech perspective, one tends to stop thinking about the rest of the world. So thank you for coming on board and welcome. Please also, just for everyone, the ISOC has released a report analyzing the certain consultations. Sorry, not the certain non-consultation, the certain directions. I think there should be a link to that in the document. Yeah, Joe's just put a link to that in chat. So please do download it and read it. We'll also mail it across to everyone. And I would suggest that maybe it's not too late, even though there isn't a public consultation, perhaps you should all send your comments to CERT-In in any case about what you think of these rules. But over to you, Joe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. Yes, so I just posted in the chat, for those of you watching via video, you may not be able to see that, a link to the Internet Impact Brief on the CERT-In cybersecurity directions that the Internet Society and the Internet Freedom Foundation co-authored and just released yesterday. I'll summarize that in all the context. And I'll try not to be too repetitive. This has been an amazing discussion. I really, really appreciate you bringing me and the Internet Society in for this. I want to have a deep thanks to MediaNama, notably Nikhil, Suvesh, Nikant, and Himanshi. I really appreciate you all working so closely to make this all happen. I also want to thank the staff of the Internet Society, especially Niti, Andre, and Raj, who have spent quite a bit of time over the past weeks working to understand these things. So I'm Joe Hall, or Dr. Hall, although my friends and family are quick to remind me that I'm not a real doctor. I'm a PhD doctor. I work at the Internet Society, which we abbreviate as ISOC, if you're not familiar with that. And we work to ensure that the Internet is a global resource that enriches humanity and that the Internet is ultimately for everyone. We have a global community of about 90,000 individual members, 87 organizational members, and 127 chapters, 6 of which are in India. All of these entities work together to try and work to make the Internet an open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy resource for the good of humanity. Myself, I'm what's called a distinguished technologist, and I'm responsible for a portfolio of projects that is around the strong Internet. You can kind of think of me as half a computer scientist, half of a lawyer, if that helps. And as some of you may be familiar with my counterpart, Machuki, who runs the Internet growth side of the house, which is about making the Internet sort of bigger and richer rather than just stronger. But today, we're here to talk about the CERT-In cybersecurity directions. We've worked hard, specifically Niti Biani, Andre Robichevsky at the Internet Society, and Pratik Wagre of the Internet Freedom Foundation have been working hard to produce the document that I shared. It's 12 pages, so it's kind of hard to digest if you're just seeing it now, but I'll summarize it. What is an Internet Impact Brief? It seems, I'm using this phrase as if you know what it is, but think of it as a compact form of impact assessment. So just as you may have seen environmental impact assessments or privacy impact assessments in other areas of policy, they use those to assess before something happens the apparent impact that a proposed rule or a law may have in certain areas of concern. We've worked over the past 2 years to create a framework for conducting Internet impact assessments. So in short, we can look at any given technical or policy proposal and analyze the direct impacts on the Internet. And we can then make a determination if that would be bad or good for the Internet, and what kind of changes might make it less bad or more good, so to speak. We had to develop a definition for what the necessary and sufficient conditions for the Internet is that we know and love. We call this the Internet way of networking. It's sort of just a phrase we use, but in short, there's 5 critical properties that we look at for the proposals like this in terms of affecting sort of fundamentally how the Internet works. I'll just mention them, but happy to follow up if anyone wants a link to a whole report that describes these. But the first is an accessible infrastructure with a common protocol. It has to be open and have low barriers to entry. The second is having an open architecture of interoperable and reusable building blocks based on open standards and voluntary adoption. The third is decentralized management with a single distributed routing system that is scalable and agile. And then the fourth, common global identifiers like IP addresses and DNS names, which are unambiguous and universal, right? It's a common language for understanding what exists on the internet. And then finally, it's important that it's a technology neutral general purpose network, which is simple and adaptable. Networks that do these 5 things are technically the internet, but those are the necessary conditions for doing the stuff that we love about the internet to be sufficient. That is, in order to achieve the goals, to achieve the true potential of the internet, we also talk about things that are what we call enablers of an open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet. Anyway, I won't bore you further with the background, but I felt I couldn't just jump into this and start talking about words that you may not know. But we have a growing number of what are called internet impact briefs and impact assessments that analyze various proposals from around the world. Everything from data localization proposals to technical proposals to require national root certificates so the government can eavesdrop, so to speak, on all communications within a country, to even things like sovereign technical internet proposals like the EU has one called Gaia X. But we're not here to talk about any of that. We're here to talk about the CERT-In cybersecurity directions. As you all know, CERT-In issued these directions at the end of April. Part of what we've been talking about in this discussion is the intent behind these directions, right? Certainly, data breaches and sort of the digital exhaust that we increasingly see, or digital toxic waste, so to speak, some people say, which are sort of the externalities or the unintended consequences of having so much data floating around. Certainly, that seems to be a big part of this intent. It's unclear how that's linked to things like the KYC cryptocurrency stuff or to the VPN requirements, as Nikhil was just talking about. It's unclear how that's related to data breaches. So maybe there's some other impetus that CERT-In and Indian government see that they want to have here for those services, but it's just unclear what they're trying to accomplish with those rules. And so just like Nikhil said, scrap the whole thing, go back to a public consultation. Couldn't agree more. And specifically, it should start with sort of a statement of what the problem is, what CERT-In and the Indian government think the problem is, because I have a feeling the collaborative approach there would come up with much better potential solutions than what we see in these directions. There are 3 particularly backwards aspects of the CERT-In directions that we've talked a bit about, but I wanted to highlight here very explicitly. And what I mean by backwards, I mean there are at least 3 ways in which these directions do the exact opposite of what they seem to want to do, which is kind of a hallmark of bad policy. If you release something that does the opposite of what you intended to do, you probably couldn't have done a worse job. But I don't want to say it's not impossible. So the first way is that, contrary to the intent of the directions, this is going to create a massive honeypot of sensitive data from all sectors that use or interact with the internet or digital computer systems. And this, I've seen nothing that leads me to believe that this set of log data that they're going to be increasingly collected is going to be protected, that it won't be easily breached by malicious actors, organized crime, or even rogue foreign governments. My government, the United States, has a very aggressive global national security and intelligence apparatus that's been eavesdropping on the whole world for many years. And there's no precision in these regulations. They seem to ask for, in the directions, every log from any ICT system, keep it for 180 days, but in the FAQ, which has a very dubious legal standing, they seem to limit that scope, but still say it depends. You need to figure it out. I don't know if crown jewels is used in there, and I don't know how to determine whether or not something that I have as an information service provider is crown jewels. But given the poor track record across the Indian government in terms of protecting sensitive information, we've seen very large breaches from Indian government entities. We can expect that any data lake, any large collection of this data of cybersecurity relevant logs will be breached, and that it's going to be at massive scale. Hopefully we will know about it by monitoring the dark web and things that we do. But that, again, is exactly the opposite of the intent of these directions. It would be a disaster to create massive data breaches while you're trying to solve the problem of ubiquitous data breaches. The second way in which the directions are doing the opposite of what they intend is this requirement to synchronize time against Indian government approved sources of time signals. That's directly in contrary, as we've discussed, to best practices in keeping good time. I wanted to give people who don't ingest or think about NTP or time signaling online sort of an intuitive feel for what's happening here. There's a real simple thing that Shivan was getting at. Said simply, if you have two standard watches that disagree with each other, you're never going to know which one's correct. You're always going to wonder, is this one correct? Is that one correct? And you just may not know unless you consult a third source of time. Now, if you have three watches and one is errant, one is not correct, or one is different, you can be reasonably confident that the other two watches are correct. And this certainty increases with the number of watches you add. So you can imagine many critical systems online, you can imagine them as people that have watches up and down their arms, so to speak, and they're constantly looking at them, trying to decide what the right time is. And if CERT-In gets its way here, Indian service providers and the Indian people will only have two watches, while the rest of the world may use as many as they want. And the reason we do this is we want to avoid timing failures, that is, unreliability in certain sources of time. We want to avoid malicious attacks against time infrastructure. Imagine if you could roll back a clock on a computer and reverse a transaction or something, right? That's a pretty serious kind of attack. And we also want to make sure that we use a diverse set of time sources. I earlier held up I love hourglasses or sand clocks. They're really interesting things. They don't keep very good time, but they're interesting because they're physical objects that keep time. It's a socially constructed thing. The agreement about time is a socially constructed thing. And here we have no idea what deviance from Indian sources of time is going to be acceptable. Is it a nanosecond? Is it a microsecond? Is it a femtosecond? Yikes. There's all these tolerances that could be in there that the directions are completely silent about. And by the way, we want to use very different sources of time. I used to be a physicist. I used to model planetary atmospheres. And there's atomic clocks, there's radioactive decay, there's all these weird things that you can use to get accurate sources of time or good sources of time. And ideally, you'd like as many diverse sources of accurate time, because you never know. Physics could be weird, and all of a sudden atomic decay works differently and all our clocks are off, but the one that doesn't use that is not off, right? So finally, the third way in which the certain directions are doing the opposite of what they intend is fundamentally about CERTs and what we call more generically around the world CSIRTs, Computer Security Incident Response Teams. In most of the cases, other than Russia, that I can think of, these are fundamentally collaborative, helpful bodies that serve as a key coordination and knowledge concentration function in national cybersecurity contexts. They're helpers, they're coordinators, they are people you can trust to disclose things to, and they'll help you in a time of need, and then work through how you're actually going to manage the public nature of disclosure and things like that. And this is a prime example of what at the Internet Society we call collaborative security. So many problems with security online can't be solved by edicts, can't be solved by one person doing something, but by us getting together, thinking about what the best way to approach a problem is, and each person taking their own actions that they can do and they can do within their role to accomplish a given security task. As we hinted at, and I hinted at in the chat, it's really dangerous to me to have a national CERT like CERT-In assuming this nodal agency role, assuming this technical authoritative role, rather than an advising or a technical elaboration kind of a role. Because what you're doing is you're now complicating the relationship between someone that you want to be coordinating and disseminating information out online about cybersecurity, and people may be less likely to share certain information. If they have to share certain information, they may find it dubious to share certain other information that they would have shared when an incident happens that they may not now, especially if you don't know how that information is going to be used. You know, if they're going to publish all these logs online, it sounds like that's not going to happen given some of the restrictions in the 2013 IT rules. But it's just not clear. You know, will they disclose these to your competitors? I know that may not be something that the Indian government may care a lot about, but it's something that industry cares about. And if you don't want people exiting the market, the Indian market, then I think there's some really serious assurances we need to give various, even NGOs like us. You know, what can we do and what can't we do? And in this case, the CERT-In is charting a new path, a concerning and dangerous path. These directions fundamentally turn CERT into a quasi law enforcement body and a tool of the surveillance state, of a surveillance state. I live in a surveillance state. And the bad thing about surveillance states is they end up collecting tons of information that is going to be used in the future for things that no one ever imagined it for. Sometimes, you know, simple things, sometimes very complicated things that we could never expect or imagine at this point in time. And now, where in the past, technical information might flow freely to CERT-In, many organizations will now be quite reluctant to provide in good faith data voluntarily because they're mandated to provide it now, right? And this is especially true when it is completely unclear what kind of secondary uses that data may put. Let me see, I'm trying to make sure I don't repeat anything that we've already talked about. I think a good place to continue is talking about some of the recommendations we would have at the Internet Society and that we published with the Internet Freedom Foundation. Well, actually, let me talk about privacy. We talked a little about privacy, didn't get too much into it. I think it's important to emphasize that this mandated logging is a data retention requirement. Even if you don't end up producing it, you're now collecting and keeping information that you may not otherwise have kept. In privacy, data minimization is a very important concept. That is, taking data and either deleting it securely or reducing the amount of data you keep and regularly examining what data you keep and how much data you keep is a really important part about for controlling data breaches. You know, if you're keeping all data forever, one, it's hard to manage, but two, eventually, if you do get a breach, that is a massive amount of data that you wouldn't otherwise have had. And there are increasingly services that, like Signal, like other kinds of things that provide end-to-end encryption or end-to-end services, or what some people may call zero knowledge services. And what is typically, there's a variety of ways to define zero knowledge, but when people use it colloquially, what they mean is that the service provider has as little data that they need to provide you the service, right? So a messaging provider may only need account information and metadata to route the messages. They don't need to keep vast amounts of data about your activities or what you were talking about. And that's important because when breaches happen or when someone loses their phone or something like that, you want to have a limited set of data from which a potential attacker could then hurt that person. And what this is doing is essentially forcing entities to keep information that they wouldn't otherwise have. And coupled with how we don't know how this stuff is going to be used by CERT-In, we don't have any guarantees whatsoever around there. That's pretty serious and an unfortunate thing. I think I'll end with some recommendations here, and I think you'll hear us repeat a couple of things that have been said before, but we really think reconsidering a one-size-fits-all approach makes sense. You know, typically small, medium businesses have fewer obligations. We also heard a lot of really good discussions about risk-based reporting and analysis, and maybe 6 or 24 hours is for especially serious kinds of things. For example, I'm not sure exactly, but you know, kidnappings. I don't know. There's much more acute kinds of incidents that can be perpetrated by cybersecurity attacks and breaches that you'd really rather people concentrate their energy on in those short timelines. And you know, I've been part of incident responses where we were convinced we had a breach, and then 48 hours into it, we realized it was not a breach. It was just our dumb computers doing dumb things. And it would have been really unfortunate if we had disclosed it as a breach to a formal entity, given a bunch of data, and then having to try and ask for that back. Do we know if CERT-In may say, oh, that's not a breach, we've securely deleted your data or whatever. Or here's your hard drives back if it's terabytes of data, right? You're not going to be, it's unlikely you're going to be sending terabytes of data over the internet unless you have a really good connection to whatever CERT-In servers we don't know about are. Second, it's essential that CERT-In implements a more focused approach, in terms of risk management and based in industry best practices, based in, as Shuman was saying, there are hard fought best practices about how to actually run things like time synchronization, such that you do a good job, and an indiscriminate approach which expects all entities to maintain all IC logs is just very burdensome. It is not going to be very helpful to CERT-In. They're going to, we have this phrase in the United States, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. These are going to be very large haystacks, and it's unclear what, if anything, CERT will be able to do with them. I think that's something that they should be able to articulate. The 6-hour requirement is just not aligned with global best practices. As we've discussed, there's 3 days in the EU GDPR, and some financial things are a little quicker, and there's pushback against some of those for good reasons. There's not a lot you can do between 6 hours and 48 or 4 days that I've seen. And maybe CERT-In has some magic mojo that they can respond quicker than everyone else, but they have not shown us that. Finally, by requiring broad access to logging information, CERT-In is taking responsibilities typical of law enforcement, which is not its role or part of its mission. The nodal agency should be something else. I don't know enough about Indian telecom or regulation to know exactly if that's a good fit, but certainly we want to preserve the collaborative relationship between CERT-In and the Indian information services community entirely. We really don't want to mess that up, or you may end up having some of the complications we see in China or India, where there are very adversarial relationships between some of these government entities because they can do pretty much anything they want with the data they have about you. Actually, finally, we should also demand that CERT-In lays out clearly the scope of the use of the information that they're going to demand, either the logs or other kinds of. They reserve the right to arbitrarily demand certain kinds of things. Does that include encryption keys, signing keys for your software distribution, which means that the Indian government could actually distribute software signed with your keys? It's just really unclear. I think we really need answers to this. We need a dialogue. I like the idea of, I would much rather have seen this as, hey, here's something we're thinking about. What do you think? World, and had an actual series of dialogue.
So I had some questions. I think one aspect which we didn't discuss enough of in the previous session was about VPNs and their role, and this requirement of collecting and storing logs of VPNs. And I'm not sure, but is there identification information of VPN users as well? VPNs typically, historically, have had a troubled relationship with law enforcement because their objectives are quite often opposing. How do you see this? Because we're seeing an attack on end-to-end encryption from the Indian government, and I felt last year, and I told a few people that the VPNs will be next, and here we are. What is your view on the VPN aspect of these guidelines?
So this, again, is a place where it's a little unclear to me. They seem to be talking about commercial VPNs that are oriented at individual end users, right? They've said that they are exempting corporate VPNs. I don't know what a corporate VPN is, but maybe they'll define that. Niti Biani at the Internet Society raised a concern recently that I just really laid this bare that I mentioned in chat, which is during the pandemic, when many students went home, Chinese students had a hard time submitting exams or schoolwork because their VPNs that they needed to connect to, in their when they're out at school in the countries that they are in school in, don't work in China. And they don't work either because they're not available. They're just, you can't get that piece of software in China, or that if you do have that software, that it literally just doesn't work when you turn it on. And so many of them couldn't do those things. And that gives you, I think, a larger sense for a VPN is not necessarily a piece of software. It's not necessarily a service. It's a concept where you have a network that has decided to say, I am allowing people to connect with me in a trusted fashion using this protocol, this piece of software, this whatever. And we see that in schools, research institutions. Governments often require you to use specific VPNs to connect externally to their services. So if I had to guess, I think they're thinking about individual commercially oriented VPNs. It's interesting that they want to, VPNs often try to keep as minimal logs as possible. One, because they just have an unbelievable amount of data and activity happening at any given point, but also because they're a security product. Many security products will say, here, be very clear, here's the information we keep or collect, here is how we treat it, here's what we do with it. Here are the instances in which we may disclose it to the government if we get a legitimate law enforcement request. So what I don't understand about the VPN requirement is how that's related to breaches or other kinds of things. It seems like they are painting VPNs with sort of a broad, malicious brush, when I really hope everyone is regularly using VPNs to protect themselves when they're in adversarial network environments, right? Like, I was just at the doctor's office, which is in a very old hospital, and they have horrific internet, and you can including weird things where if you're not using an encrypted connection, you have things injecting into, it's weird stuff. And so I need to turn on a VPN to make sure that my packets aren't messed with, or my work might get mad, the doctor's office might get mad, So I'm not sure, Nikhil, what to say other than I really would like them to clarify what they think is so concerning with VPNs, because there are, as Shuman was talking about, there may be some already created, we may not have to reinvent anything. We may be able to reuse, for example, the VPN Transparency Initiative recently released a whole set of principles that many of the VPNs in the world, the large ones, are abiding by now, that include a bunch of things that I think would go towards solving what I think the Indian government may see as problems. But then again, I'm not sure they're going to tell us exactly what they think the problem is.
I think one just as an example, and with my limited understanding of technology, one issue might be that there are frauds that are being committed, and those particular emails or messages are being sent with a VPN connection active. And that's where the identification trail for a potential fraudster ends. And it's because they're unable to close the loop. And I don't know whether, even if they have ID information, if that will help them close the loop. That's what they're trying to address. So they're coming at this with a limited myopic mindset of solving that one problem that law enforcement agencies face.
And those need to be targeted solutions, in my opinion. I don't know who had said it. Maybe it was I don't know who said it, but in many law enforcement contexts, there are what we call principles of, either due process or limitation, right? You only are allowed to get access to certain information for certain kinds of crimes, right? Fraud may be one of them, but you don't need to have a blanket law that treats everyone as a criminal, so to speak. So we collect everyone's data and then you sort through it later, right? That is a recipe for disaster, and it is undemocratic, in my opinion.
That's an approach that's also being taken to our data protection bill, with vast exemptions for the Indian government and for certain agencies that they will notify, more exemptions for them, so that there isn't that set of limitations. And I guess addressing VPNs en masse is a similar approach.
Well, I mean, people are going to move to VPNs that are provided without a service provider. So, there are things like Tailscale, Algo, a bunch of VPNs you can run on your own, right? That don't require a service provider. Anyway, it's a little technical, but it's not that technical. And send email to me if you want to know more about setting up your own VPN.
I'm not sure whether it would be legal to set up your own VPN in India, by the way.
Really? Oh, that's too bad.
The lawyers might know more about this, but what do you think about the 180-day logging requirement? In terms of how can that be limited in terms of serving the purpose that they want, right? In terms of access to when there is a breach of significance, getting access to data. Or when they're investigating something, getting access to data, and at the same time not overburden most of the internet with that requirement?
180 days is a really long time. I have very limited experience in what's called DFIR, Digital Forensics and Incident Response. Shimon has much more experience, and others on this call may. But many incidents, unless they're really like endemic, where someone has been in your system and established a foothold and are a persistent attacker, we call them, ones who it's not just an event, they're attacking you over and over and over again because they have a way in. I lost my train of thought. I apologize. Get it back. Well, anyway, what were we talking about? I don't know why I went off on this little tangent in my head and could not come back.
No, I was talking about the 180.
180 days. Okay, exactly. That's exactly what I needed. So with such a imprecise focus on what kinds of incidents they're like, port scanning is listed in the directions, right? Which is like, I don't know why that's there. Computers online right now receive a port scan many times a second. It's just how it is. That's how the internet works. And so those clearly are not things that I think CERT-In is going to find very instructive, and it's going to be a lot of data, right? And when we think about incident response, many of the less serious incidents do not need 180 days of logging data for you to figure out. You just need, DNS providers typically log 24 to 48 hours of data to do debugging mostly, but it's also useful for certain kinds of incident response. I don't know what particular kinds of incidents are going to be solved with 180 days that wouldn't be solved by, say, 2 weeks, 14 days, which still seems long, but it's not nearly as long. And here is where I think the onus should be on CERT-In to say, hey, the most serious incidents, the most complex incidents require 6 months, 180 days of logs. And that's why we're setting the bar high, because we don't know when you report to us if you have one of these more serious incidents where we need to have much more longitudinal time-based information, or something that is much more simple. But you would like to think that what they would do is, like we've been talking about, have a graded response where if you think your incident is somewhat modest of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a word that's not severe, less severe, then you provide a certain scope of information with a certain time limit, and then they can say, hey, this looks more serious, please continue logging in the future. I don't know how, it's hard to comment on how to tailor that kind of a number without knowing a bit more about the things that they care about. Like, I think they may be, my hint is, or my intuition is that given the mean time to discovery, so the average time that a breach is discovered is like 280 days in India right now. It's long, but it's long pretty much everywhere. But that it may be tailored on a data breach kind of requirement that, well, given the mean time to discovery is this, almost 3/4 of a year, we want to have enough of a chunk of that time period to be able to reconstruct it. So maybe they'll reduce that logging requirement in the future if the mean time to discovery becomes smaller. But then again, we don't know. They haven't told us that. And so I would love to see why they think that's necessary rather than 30 days, right? Which I think the vast majority of garden variety cyber incidents are going to be pretty easily resolved with 30 days. But then again, I would love to see a technical analysis from CERT-In, who should be able to do this, that talks about the distribution of incidents and how they actually picked that number rather than just sort of grabbing it out of the air or taking it from a previous regulation.
So I know we asked Suman this, but what is your view on the technical feasibility of the 6-hour reporting timeline?
Wow.
And at what levels is it, at what size of organization or size of team is it possible? And how does this impact different types of organizations?
So cybersecurity isn't war, and I try not to use too many war-related analogies, but when you're in the depths of an incident response, it can feel like the fog of war. Things change constantly. You get new information constantly. The attackers may realize you've discovered them and may be starting to do horrible things to your system because now they know that they've been discovered, they've been revealed. Trying to also comply at that point with the 6-hour notice and production of data requirement, right? I think it's notice, but they expect you to have the data and they can ask for the data. That just seems like it's going to do nothing good to the first responders who have to come and respond to these kinds of incidents. I think another important aspect when we talk about that fog, we mentioned this a little bit, but there's so much uncertainty during when you first think you have an incident. There's just so much uncertainty, and you may discover that something you thought was an incident isn't an incident, and you may have a continuous incident, and there's very little information or promise that they will think about how we deal with those kinds of things under this new framework. And I'll stop rambling. I think that brackets my thoughts.
No, I'm about the size of the organization and the size of team required.
Oh yeah. Oh well, and that's the thing is that it's going to depend on what you do, right? Like WhatsApp, when it was bought by Facebook, was 20 employees. With
but about 18 to 20, yeah.
But serving hundreds and hundreds of millions of users, right? And that's not. It's a little unique, but not terribly unique these days for the kinds of things that we like to see. The second something goes viral, all of a sudden your small team may be dealing with much more, many more types of data, having to provision cloud servers to be able to handle the kinds of demand you have. In general, companies or organizations with very large operations are gonna be able to respond much better because they'll have dedicated staff. Like you were saying, Nikhil, MediaNama is a small outfit. The Internet Society is a small outfit. People who run their own servers online, people who just wrote an app in their garage, right? Like all these people are going to be implicated by this. I think that it would be nice if there were some effective limits, like something that said, essentially, we expect you to, I don't know how they would word this, but we expect you to spend this amount of money and time on this effort. And if it exceeds half of your revenue, that's probably a bad number, but there's got to be some point past which doing this is not, the juice is not worth the squeeze, so to speak. And I still wonder what they're going to do with all that stuff. It would, and I'm trying to think, for the Internet Society to keep this amount of logs and to produce stuff on a 6-hour basis, I think we would need to have people on call, which we don't have. People with beepers, if you remember those, but it's phones now. Essentially, people who at any point in time are going to have to come to our facility, one of our facilities around the world, and deal with perceived incidents. They can't just wait until the morning or whatever. And it's unclear to me, but it would at least be, for small organizations, I think, 2 to 3 full-time staff for this kind of a thing. It really depends on what they actually do with their computers to try and understand how to cost keeping and producing these kinds of logs. And then, you may have insurance liability, because if you give it to the Indian government and then it gets breached, you may have legal obligations elsewhere in the world that you now are on the hook for. And all of this seems to be sort of unclear, I think, is the theme of the day.
How complicated is it to localize this data?
That's a really good question, Nikhil. The directions in the FAQ specifically say it's not everybody, it's just Indian users or Indian computers that you need to log access to. That means you're going to have a very good idea of who your users are Indian or are in the Indian subcontinent. And you may not collect that data. You may have an IP address, which you can make some guesses about where that may be, but those are often, depending on which service you use, very inaccurate, right? But anyway, the point being, even if you could determine here's the subset of your users and devices that are within Indian jurisdiction, then you end up having to, you can't just turn on a logging facility, right? You're going to have to turn it on and then make sure that lines from the log from those users or those devices are copied to another computer that is keeping things for production for the Indian government and CERT-In, right? And you may make mistakes like that. CERT-In doesn't say, maybe you get fined if you actually make a mistake and don't capture certain, you make a mistake and you don't know if someone is Indian, or you over capture or something like that. That is also a concern. And then they think that that's helping with the burden, but like it's unclear, because if they want all the logs because they want to understand how an attack works, but then you only cut out of all those logs the Indian pieces, you're eliminating the rest of the world. An attacker is probably going to come from, all sorts of places to attack things. And so you're going to have an incomplete set of data. And so it's kind of weird. Like it's, at the same time that they want complete data production, they're trying to say, oh, but just Indian people or Indian devices. And that in itself is breaking the whole reason that they want this stuff, which is to have a holistic picture of the sort of data.
Just to illustrate this, if let's say you were to attack my server, the only logs that the Indian government would get would be mine.
Yeah. Unless I attacked you from an Indian. Yeah, unless I broke into an Indian computer and then attacked you, and presumably they would keep that log, and then maybe you could go find that Indian computer. But if I'm from somewhere else, it's unclear that we would keep.
Which means that it makes sense for anyone that's launching an attack on an Indian server to do it not from India.
I think so.
And that then increases the that layer of, that increases the lack of information or the information that the Indian government doesn't have or potentially can't get. But of course, then also that attack can't originate in India because they won't have VPNs to use.
Well, I mean, VPNs are actually kind of a weird way to accomplish an attack. Maybe for fraud, it makes more sense, but VPNs are not nearly as anonymous or privacy protective in an attacking sense as you might think. Anyway, I'll just say that and not go into the details because it gets complicated.
Sarvesh, do you have any questions?
Oh, no, Nikhil, none. I read the report and I think a lot of my questions were answered in that.
Well, thank you.
So just in terms of, let's say, these directions were issued and 60 days were given for compliance. What's a reasonable time frame for compliance for directions such as this?
Wow. It's hard to say given the uncertainty, but I would think you would want much more like a 6-month period where people could say, okay, we know we need to do this. Let's try to do it. Let's come up with problems or road bumps, or some businesses may say, by planning and implementing to do this, when we turn it on, we're going to go out of business in 3 months because we're spending so much on this now. Like there's the technical implementation, and then there's the business case. Like, can you continue to serve Indian users if you have to comply with these rules? And we've seen it. It looks like ExpressVPN has made a decision that they can't. I'm not sure how much of that is technical and how much of that is just protesting against the process.
No, they've moved servers out, and now the IT ministries, it seems, or someone in the government is saying that even if they've moved servers out, just because they're serving Indian customers, it means that they're still going to be covered by these rules.
Legal jurisdiction sounds like, connections to Indian users, not necessarily physical presence of the server. Oh boy. That's unfortunate. I would think 6 months at a minimum. GDPR, I think, what did it have, 2 years, right? And that was much more complicated, I think. Much more complicated, but like that's the kind of time frame over which you can be sure that a large, diverse set of companies can plan for, iron out any wrinkles. Like this should be a dialogue. It should be like, here's what we think you should do, and the companies can come back and say, oh, we can do all that. We're going to do all that, or we can do all that except for these things are particularly onerous. That would be much more carefully tailored to the problem at hand if you asked us to do this, whatever that would be, right? But we see no dialogue or conversation whatsoever, and I'm really concerned about that. Even with, it sounds like the content moderation rules that media is considering,
they got
that those are undergoing. Say it again.
The content moderation rules that I spoke about that came out today, they got pulled.
I just try to get them, and like it's not working.
Yeah, they got pulled.
Jeez.
While this conversation was happening, I was coordinating some of that, but
that's just the point, right?
Yeah. I have so just to end, I'd like a philosophical answer from you on something. I mean, what do guidelines like these mean for the global nature of the internet at one, and for jurisdictions that haven't looked at creating regulations for cybersecurity incidents? And so at the Internet Society, what are your concerns about this, about these guidelines?
So one of the biggest concerns we've had starting at the beginning of this year is what we call the splinter net, that this global resource that we love and enjoy, that, I've seen people say the last words to their family over HD video in an isolation ward for coronavirus that never would have happened even 10 years ago, right? There are things we simply could never do before that we can do now with the internet. These kinds of rules will create separate notions of what the internet is and how it means to operate on the internet. Syncing to a specific set of time servers is directly against the spirit and the technical best practices that we have for actually doing good time operations online. So that's something we're really concerned with. Is increasingly around the world, governments know the internet exists now. They know that that there are problems that society has that are exacerbated by certain kinds of activities online. Everyone's trying to deal with them, but these sort of hard regulatory moves, and we've seen them in so many places. We have internet impact briefs about lots of them: Kazakhstan, Mauritius, even like the United States with its US Clean Network program, which longer discussion for another time. All of those threaten this global resource that we have that's called the internet. We're also, as you were saying, and you may have hinted at, India sets a really important example for like-minded countries. We've seen Bangladesh and Cambodia take up pieces of the intermediary guidelines, but translated to their own context in such a way that they've become even more dangerous, so to speak, right? In those countries, we have reams of analysis in those places. And so in addition to potentially exacerbating this thing we call the splinter net, creating an experience where you can't talk to someone around the world like we're doing right now. We can't share ideas about how to best organize cyberspace and how society interacts with cyberspace. And India sets a really important example that many other countries in around the world look to follow about what's reasonable. And man, I would really much rather have a collaborative, knowledgeable dialogue with Indian government entities and nodal agencies like CERT-In, because that is how we're going to end up with rules and regulations and even best practices that enhance and eliminate some of the bad things on the internet, but without all these other potentially bad unintended consequences. I don't think any of these consequences, I would hope, are at the heart of what CERT-In or the Indian government want to do. And I would hope they would be listening and understand that we're all here to try and work on these problems, and that unilateral kinds of edicts like this really are only going to cause a lot of problems.
If it isn't global, it isn't the internet.
I love it.
So thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us for this discussion. Really appreciate you taking time out and getting up this early your time to stay through the discussion. I hope you found this useful, and I hope everyone attending got something to take home. My recommendation is that I know there's no public consultation, but please treat it like one and send in your comments to CERT-In. Let them know what you think about the challenges that these issues create. There doesn't seem to be a move to change or withdraw these guidelines, and they're digging in their heels. But I still think that if there's sufficient emails going to them, as we saw once with Save the Internet, who knows, there might be a change. So thank you all for joining us. If you wish to revisit the stream for today, it is on MediaNama's YouTube channel. And I know many of you go and revisit the stream later on for your notes. If you'd like to write about these rules for us, please do let us know. If you'd like to support our work, please do subscribe to MediaNama. There's a link in the comments, and there'll be a link on the site as well. We'll be writing about this discussion, compiling comments into a report. We'd like to thank the Internet Society, Meta, and E2E networks for their support. As the session ends, you'll be redirected to our sign-up form for our daily newsletter, which has a free read a day. So do sign up and check out the newsletter. I hope what we write is useful for you. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day. Thank you.